Doctor Who Christmas stories did not start with Russell T Davies' Christmas Invasion with David Tennant, or Mark Gatiss' Unquiet Dead with Chris Eccleston. Indeed, we've done a discussion previously on Robert Shearman's 2002 The Chimes of Midnight classic great Christmas audio with Paul McGann. But this Christmas, we're looking at another Christmas audio, Sylvester McCoy's Seventh Doctor 2003 audio drama from prolific Doctor Who writer Jonathan Morris, entitled Flip Flop. The story is totally accessible on Spotify as well. It's one of those ones that you can freely go and listen to on Spotify because it's an old, early Big Finish. You can go right onto Spotify and listen to the whole thing. And it's also quite cheap on Big Finish's own website. So it's very easy to access this story. Where to begin with Flip Flop? Where Moffat might use the mythology of Christmas to explore how the passage of time informs relationships. Or RTD might use the commercialism of Christmas to poke at family dynamics. Or Rob Shearman might use Christmas to quickly build up a world of ritualism and class conflict. Flip Flop uses Christmas in a surprisingly directed political way. So, from the depths of winter, my English friends Ingiga and Oliver join me to discuss this Christmas story I am positive we three all have plenty of thoughts on. Merry Christmas to both of you.
Have a glorious retribution day to you both.
I want to start by asking both of you, how did you first listen to Flip Flop? Why did you first listen to Flip Flop? I think this story's reputation precedes it in multiple ways, so I'm interested how you came to the story first. Oliver, how did you come to it? What did you know about it before you listened to it?
So it was about 2 years ago, and I think I was just working my way through the main range audios. I had done all 8 stuff earlier and was going back to fill in the rest of it. And I had prioritized the Ace stuff over the Mel stuff because I don't like Mel that much. And so it took me a long time to get round to, which meant I had heard a lot about Flip Flop, and all the things I had heard had been, oh, isn't it clever? It's got a clever little conceit. You can listen to the 2 discs in either order. And then I sat down to listen to it and was shocked and aghast and outraged and wanted to write letters to the BBC about how terribly racist it is.
Gig, why and how did you first listen to Flip Flop?
Well, I never did the big main range completion quest like a lot of people have done. This must have been about like 10-ish years ago. I was just sort of dipping around various Big Finish audios, whichever my bandwidth would allow. And really, I think what interested me about this one is, I guess, what you'd think, because the way it's talked about, the idea of the story where you can listen to the 2 sides in either order. I mean, there are lots of works in the world of literary fiction, for example, where writers have used structures where you can sort of interchange or map your own path through it. There's a whole sort of category of ergodic fiction, as it's called, where you can kind of...
How dare you imply this isn't seminal?
Well, regardless, hearing that, obviously, I mean, I had to check it out, right? Because, I mean, it's just like one of those stories. When Big Finish gets experimental, you get stuff, well, in this period, you get stuff like Doctor Who and the Pirates, which is really cool.
Yes.
And, I think and also it was...
The Holy Terror.
Live 34.
Yeah, indeed. So I think it's reasonable that you'd go into this story expecting, something pretty good, pretty interesting, pretty novel. You at least will have to see how they pulled it off and whether the intricacy of it is all satisfying enough to make it worth listening to.
Yeah. I want to get into Jonathan Morris as a writer in a moment. For me, why and how I first listened to Flip Flop, I've listened to the audios for ages, and it was just one of the ones I'd always heard good things about, and I'd always heard specifically, it's really clever. It's really, really clever. And it does really interesting structural things with the format and all that good stuff. And there's Big Finish stories, I think, are really clever and do really interesting structural things with the format. Jim Mortimer's Natural History of Fear, Oliver mentioned Live 34. There's a bunch, especially from this pre-New Who period, that were doing really cool stuff with the format. So I figured this is going to be great. I've heard this talked up as one of the greats. So we got lots to unpack there. But I want to walk through Johnny Morris as a writer first, because he's written so much Doctor Who. Not on TV, but in all the other arenas, comics, books, audios, part of the Time Lord Victoria stuff. He's done loads and loads of stuff. And so since we're going to be pretty critical about this story, I think it's worth framing him up a little bit. So some other stuff he's done. Touched by an Angel, which is a lot of people's favourite 11th Doctor book, some people's favourite new series book in general. I don't know if either of you have read it. I haven't, but I have some friends that say it's really good.
I was going to read it, but then, on Twitter, he compared Chris Eccleston to, I think it was Tony Blair, in the Ninth Doctor, to Tony Blair specifically, and then I swore off ever reading anything by him ever again.
It's on my list as an Angels thing.
Yeah. Well, you can't get out of it like we can. You have to read it at some point.
Legally obligated.
He did a bunch of 8th Doctor and Lucy audios, which were fine, I thought. Yeah, those were not too bad. The ones he did of that. He did Psychodrome with the 5th Doctor, which I believe Gig likes.
Yeah, and both the other story in that box set is a John Dorney one, which is what you'd expect of Dorney. And I think both those stories in that box set are trying to give that set of companions, like Adric and them, a bit more interiority to them. And I think they do a fairly good job of it. I wouldn't say it's like a classic or anything, but I think it was... it added to my perception of Morris as someone who is capable of writing things.
He did Mary's story, which I sincerely love. That's an 8th Doctor and Mary Shelley, the original, you might say, 8th Doctor and Mary Shelley story. And it's a short one. It's about half an hour, and it's really, really good. No reservations. That's a great story. It's both clever and fun, and it's just really, it's a great time. I really, really like that one a lot. He's done so much stuff, we can't actually list it out because we'd be here forever. It's just, I'm scrolling down the list and he's done bits of everything. He's done a good Rose Tyler spin-off story, and he's done a terrible... He did a story called The Bechdel Test, where Missy and River meet and talk about the Doctor a lot, which might give you some insight into his sense of humour. But a lot of that is new series Johnny Morris. Let's think back to when this came out, 2003. Let's think back to pre-New Who Johnny Morris and where this story came from. Because like we said, Big Finish was in quite an experimental era back then. So looking back at some contemporary interviews with Johnny Morris, I've got one here where he's talking about his inspiration for writing a book called The Tomorrow Windows. And he said, "I was very conscious of the need to make my book stand out. Every month there seem to be 100-odd new Doctor Who stories being released, and most of them get buried in the smooge." And then, in an interview about Flip Flop from 2021, he says...
I think the Holy Terror had come out, and the Holy Terror was... And I'd listened to the One Doctor had come out, because that was a big influence on it. So it was sort of pushing things, and I was sort of desperate for attention to show off. And so I'd go, well, I'll try and do something which no one has ever done before. To tell a two-part story where the two parts can be listened to in either order. I think I got carried away with the idea, to be honest, and it gets very, very complicated.
But, it's that whole idea of the stories it's in quarters, like, all those old Big Finishes, but it's in two halves, the white half and the black half. And you can listen to the white half first or the black half first, and the story will make as much sense as it will either way. It doesn't make particularly more or less sense, depending on whether you start from the first and second part or the third and fourth part.
With his comments about both the book and this story, about how he really wanted to stand out, I think implicitly there, it's kind of saying something about the other spin-off content that's coming out, like, surrounding this one. Like, the book, for example, he describes the smooge and how books just get lost in, like, the deluge of content in a way. So, in a sense, maybe it's like his urge to try and gimmick stuff up and sort of do these kind of self-indulgent conceits and stuff. It's motivated by, I guess, just maybe it feels weird to say, like, the state of, like, the rest of the content, because obviously Big Finish was doing other really interesting stuff around the same time. I think it's just like the nature of Doctor Who spin-off media, because it's such in a way it sort of goes on forever. You can just keep doing these almost production line Doctor Who stories. I think sometimes it motivates a writer to just try and just do something for the sake of doing it, like anything to keep it interesting.
You mentioned in the introduction Rob Shearman, and I think that's a really good comparison because before we get into the more political stuff, the thing that I think you probably might have found underwhelming, that I found underwhelming listening to it for the first time, is that it's not actually very ergodic as a story. It's not very... the two halves play off each other by being basically the same either way around.
Yeah.
It's the same disc twice with a palette swap, and the colour's inverted, which means that it's not... You don't get anything more. I switched the order of listening. I started this time with the black disc and listened to the white disc afterwards, and it's just the same. They're the same story on two different discs with a palette swap, with a lot of the same scenes copy pasted exactly, which sort of takes the wind out of the sails of any clever use of the technique.
Yeah, it's got a lot of minor tweaks of dialogue and individual lines, which it paradoxically just enhances how repetitive and interchangeable the action actually is, because it's just so similar. The fact that he makes a point of changing some metaphor that Mel uses, like she says Edgar Allan Poe instead of some other artist, and it's like, God, really? That this is how you consider changing things around? I mean, and actually, like, the similarity is indicative of like some of the broader biases underlying the story. But really, it's just, I think the only real effect is that whichever disc you listen to first, the first episode, like the first bit of it, is going to sound like gibberish until you perhaps go back to it after listening to the other half. But, you might not do that because it's kind of boring. So, yeah, you get a lot of stuff which only gets explained at the end of the other disc. But, that's pretty much the limit of it.
One of the bits is... there's a scene that's almost identical, except on the white disc, the Doctor says, let's hope this doesn't get even more complicated. And on the black disc, he says, let's hope this doesn't get even more convoluted. Yes. Like, that's the level of palette swap going on for a lot of the story. And not all of it. There are bits that play off the two halves slightly differently. But for a large part of the runtime, it's basically copy and pasted across the two.
Yeah, that's the thing.
There's two things to that. One is that when the story is talked about, whether it's by fans or by Morris himself, it's often in kind of the thematic terms or like the big technique terms of what's being accomplished in this story, or the big high concept stuff. You can listen to it in either order. 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 That's basically the sum of so much conversation about this story. If you break down the scenes, like he did extensively to actually write this, since, all the scenes are completely mirrored, the story is about the Doctor, the two lead characters in a story, passively being dragged around to go through the same thing twice over a course of 2 hours. It's bad.
Yeah, there's lots of oh, we're trapped in a cell. Okay, I'm breaking the lock. Okay, I've broken the lock. We're escaping.
They get broken out by people from another timeline at one point.
You've got to rip the Band-Aid off. This is a bad story. And if you actually look at what's happening in it, apart from the hours being basically identical, and Mel, on the white side, she spells out what's happening in the whole story just a couple of minutes in. These characters are so passive and they're so uninvolved in what's going on. We're just dragged through the same, even if all the politics drained out of it. It's not even that it's the same thing. It's just they're not doing anything. They're just getting moved around, and we're just getting the same conflicts relitigated.
An enormous amount of it is just characters being confused because of something happening that they don't know why it's happening. How can there be two of these people at once? What's going on? But I thought you were someone else. There's just so much of that material just like filling the time.
The fact that this is spoken in the same breath as writers like Shearman or Mortimer, or even stuff like Live 34, I just think it's ridiculous, because this story is straining and struggling, and you can basically hear it wheezing, trying to make the concept work. And there's no real story emanating out of the concept. It's just struggling so hard to try and make the concept work. If you can listen to it in either order, this just feels like an exercise to me, basically. But I think Morris, although he's quite self-effacing these days when he talks about the story, and he's quite upfront about the stuff he thinks didn't work in it, it's interesting to go back around the 2000s when he was writing it and see how he talked about it Then, this isn't an interview about this story specifically, but in an interview from the 2000s, he's talking about other novels he likes, and he's talking other Doctor Who novels he likes, and he says, in terms of books by other authors, the usual suspects, Alien Bodies by Lawrence Miles, who we talked about at length in our Unquiet Dead, are kind of paired discussion to this one. I think Oliver framed them as the two xenophobic Doctor Who Christmas stories.
Yeah, Saturn Alien Saga.
Yeah. So he says he likes Alien Bodies, Human Nature from Paul Cornell, Lance Parkin's The Dying Days, The Witch Hunters, Gareth Roberts' ones. They belong to that very select, very small number of books that I've read and not thought I could do better than this.
Huh.
And then that interview ends on the interviewer asking, who's the companion you'd most like to spend an evening on the town with? And Morris replies, the second Romana, because she'd be smart, funny, sexy, and dressed as a schoolgirl.
Interesting.
So, yeah. And I mean, this story also has quite a bit of sexual content. There's all the ribald stuff about unwrapping a present, and there's, the whole sex scandal and love triangle and whatnot. So I thought that little bit of his taste worth including. I mean, he said that in a public interview, so it's out there.
Yeah, there's a lot of talk about how clever, the story supposedly is, but I think there are two different conceptions of cleverness, I think, at work here. Because in the sense of having maybe a jigsaw puzzle and being able to sort of put things together in a way in which they connect and they all fit. And then there's, I think, the other kind of cleverness, which is, I guess, the more writerly one, where you're actually being clever with making themes and characters fit together in a way that illuminates something else, something larger. Right, and that latter one is completely absent from the story. I think. I mean, I guess the only really way in which the form echoes any sort of theme is that thing that they take great pains to impress upon the listener, which is how, you shouldn't think the grass is always greener on the other side. Just because you don't like how things are at the moment doesn't mean you should try and change them.
I maybe slightly disagree with the two of you, but agree with what Gig was saying there, that I think that the form actually does mirror the politics quite well. It's almost coherent at many points. That those two things really go together. Like you're saying, the grass is always greener. There's a centrism that I want to talk about a bit later. But none of that is ever rooted in the characters, who are always just getting dragged through. Which is sort of a trap of these time loop stories.
Yes, very much.
Is that naturally events need to happen in a certain order, in a certain way, which means the author's hand becomes more prominent, which means the characters disappear in the mix. Which, as a Weeping Angelologist, is sort of what the Weeping Angels are all about. That tension between the characters and determinism. But there's none of that here. Everyone's just on a set path, and the story loops around that path twice.
There really is a lot of insufferable time travel bullshit in the story. Like the whole element of the Doctor and Mel jumping back a day just so we can get more complications, and oh my goodness, things are happening, but there's paradox, blah, 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 blah. It's just, I fucking hate this kind of storytelling that just ranks itself off with how well it can write paradoxes and predestination loops and, people running around and jigging around. It's a nightmare. And yeah, and you may have surmised, because I've mentioned it before, I watched the Netflix show Dark. I watched every episode. It's so fucking bad, and I'm still so mad about it.
Well, to bring things back to Christmas, like the Unquiet Dead, our sort of paired discussion here, as Oliver puts it, this didn't come out at Christmas time. Anyway, this came out around July, August 2003. And so some of the early promo for the story in Doctor Who magazine was like a big ad, and at the top in purple it said, in quotation marks, "I would like to wish all citizens a jubilant Christmas. Any humans found on the streets will be prosecuted. Fatally." And then it's got Sylvester McCoy and Bonnie Langford in Doctor Who Flip Flop, a circular audio drama by Jonathan Morris, blah, 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 £14. And then it's got a picture there. And the picture, I don't want to get into, because we'll talk about the picture at length later, but the picture is pretty arresting, what I think is important about the picture is that people are seeing this before they hear the story. The same as if they buy the CD or they listen to the story for free on Spotify. pretty much everyone listening to this story is going to see the cover art beforehand. And so the cover art, textless and everything, so it's even more discernible, is there on this ad from Doctor Who magazine 333. Let's look at the CD itself. So the back of the CD, the way the story is described is Christmas Eve in the year 3060, and the planet Puxatorni is home to a prosperous human colony. A spacecraft has arrived in orbit carrying the Slithergees, a race of obsequious alien slugs. Their homeworld has been destroyed, and they are humbly requesting permission to settle on the first moon. And if they don't get permission, then they are humbly threatening to declare all-out war. The future hangs in the balance. The decision rests with Bailey, the colony's president, but she has other things on her mind. Christmas Eve in the year 3090, and the planet Puxatorni has changed beyond all recognition. The Doctor and Mel arrive on a completely unrelated mission to defeat a race of terrible monsters, and soon discover that something rather confusing has been happening to history. And then, italicized, Flip-Flop is a unique innovation in storytelling, a Doctor Who adventure told over 2 CDs, which can be listened to in either order. And then, and you don't get this on Spotify, if you open up the CD itself, and so you get the notes inside, you've got a little message from Jonathan Morris. What does Johnny have to say? Jonathan Morris says, this is from March 2003, Jonathan Morris, when asked why he'd write plays and then store them under his bed, unread for 6 months, Joe Orton would explain that he was allowing them to mature. The idea being that by the time he came to look at the scripts again, he would have gained some critical distance and developed as a writer. Flip-Flop went through a similar process, though rather than being hidden under Joe Orton's mattress, the script was stored on Gary Russell's hard drive. I came up with the initial idea in August 2001 while writing Arachnophobia, and completed the first draft in February 2002, then the second draft in June 2002, and the third draft in December 2002. Then it was recorded in March 2003, and if all has gone according to schedule, you're reading this in July 2003. A lot has happened over that time, and I think Flip-Flop reflects that. I'm certainly not the person I was back in 2001. The story has grown more serious and more silly, just as I have grown more serious and more silly. And we've both got a great deal more complicated. So I hope you enjoyed. It's a farce-political-satire-mystery-time-travel-romance-tragedy-action-adventure-horror-comedy, just like my life of the last 2 years, except for the bit about time travel. Oh, and one additional thing. This story is told over 2 CDs, one black and one white, the idea being that it can be enjoyed irrespective of whether you listen to the black one first or the white one first. Indeed, because you can listen to it in 2 different ways, you are effectively getting 2 stories for the price of one, and this release therefore represents excellent value for money. But it's not a puzzle to try and find out which way round is the proper or canonical way of listening to the CDs, because there honestly isn't one. And also, the only other bit worth raising from this little bit of the inside notes is CGI Slithergee by Chris Gregory. Just because I'm trying to track who came up with a Slithergee representation, because a different artist did it for the short comic strip about them in Doctor Who magazine 333. But I assume Chris Gregory came up with the original Slithergee that then the comic was written from the likeness of, but I'm not necessarily blaming Chris Gregory with how they look, because for all I know, Gary Russell or someone else in power kind of instructed him how to do them. Who knows? But what do you think of the blurb on the back of the CD and then Johnny's note inside the CD there?
Just on the note from Morris, I just want to say one thing. He mentions in that long hyphenated list of things the story is, he mentions political and satire in there. So that's him pretty much outright saying, like, this is a political satire. You can interpret it that way. So you can't really make excuses for the story on the idea of, oh, it's not political.
And he's saying satire specifically, which I really want to dig into later, because he's made his sights plain in what he's saying there. But when people try and say, I honestly don't think Johnny Morris was thinking of politics writing this story, he was writing a very political story. You can argue he wasn't intending to do certain stuff in it, but then he was writing a very political story here. I've no patience for a lot of the excuses that get raised around this one, because he himself doesn't try to excuse the whole thing anymore anyway. He himself is kind of regretful over it now. in many regards at least.
And we're going to be pulling some quotes that, even if he was denying that it was political, even to today, the direct quotes from the thing that people will be seeing and hearing about later on are absolutely definitive in and of themselves.
But it's a satire.
It's satire, though.
That satire means get out of jail free pass. That's all I know what satire means. I think satire means slightly sarcastic and you get away with it. That's YouTube's told me that's what satire is. I don't think it has any other meaning.
Say a thing you believe, but with no consequences.
Just means slightly sarcastic.
Just something from the blurb on the back of the CD I want to pull out. And they mention in the italicized text, flip-flop is a unique innovation in storytelling. And that's an interesting way of putting it, because it's kind of, I guess when I think of innovations in something, in a field, I think of things that, I guess, blow open what that field can do, maybe provide a basis for further explorations or improvements, or like things to like really take the field forward in a way. I mean, the idea of innovating something. So when I think of this story, it's sort of this story, on the other hand, it feels more like the opposite. It feels more like it's self-enclosing almost. It's like it's a form of storytelling which is actually rather anti-story, like, and anti, I guess. Do you see what I mean? I think the nature of the way in which the story sort of feeds into itself in this eternal loop, I think ends up being something that is actually counterproductive to the idea of telling stories, particularly Doctor Who stories and stuff in, I guess, just stories, period. It feels like whatever the opposite of an innovation is.
Absolutely. Both discs end with the main characters going, well, I guess the other versions of ourselves will deal with this, which loops back in itself.
You know how a lot of songs, especially these days, like end specifically not on the root note, because then it feels unresolved and you got to stream the song again, and so you just kind of eternally loop the song. It's really it's clever songwriting, honestly. I feel like this story is kind of built like that. It's built different that way, that you end either side and you kind of like, well, I got to listen to the other side to try and make a bit more sense of this in my head. I see some people do, they listen to it loads of times. They finish it and then they're like, well, I want to understand the plot a little bit more, and I listen to it again. And, I take my hat off to them because they've got more resilience than me.
I don't respect that at all, to be honest. I think if you look at the timescales reviews for this, you will see a comment that is repeated with people saying, hey, well, this story theoretically goes on forever. And that's listed like it's a positive. Like it's just an inherently good thing for a story to go on forever and be infinite. Like that's inherently so great. And I have to assume the mindset behind that is just one where endless content is a virtue unto itself. So it's almost a platonic ideal for a certain kind of fan. A story that goes on forever, just doing this shit run around of characters killing each other and whatever.
I have a picture that's really relevant to what you just brought up. This picture is what you were just saying, reminds me of this classic picture, which I see a lot of certain types of video game fans follow this kind of philosophy, where it's like the more hours you can extract out of something, the better. Like if a game is theoretically 500 hours long, I don't care if 200 of those hours are just following the bird feathers strewn across the map. I've got more value for my money. And so my life has been maximized and made more efficient. It's just this kind of conception of your own entertainment and leisure time. So the idea of a story you can repeat on end being like of more value in that sense. I mean, there are stories that you can mine more out of. Sure. No, God, I'm a hypocrite, aren't I? Because I totally think there are stories you can go over again and again. But
that's because they have a richness in them rather than because you can just listen to them on loop and get the equivalent.
This is more like the primer thing, where it's not like you're going to be finding more subtext or more depth in the story exactly the more times you go over it, but you are going to understand I'm not insulting primer, I'm about to compliment primer. You're going to get more of the mechanics of the story out of it the more you go over it. And with primer, the film, which is this time travel film, it was a big cult hit. I remember it was a huge deal when it came out. Primer is very convoluted, but the rules it sets up are quite consistent. And so there's a kind of a joy a lot of people find in going over the film a lot to work out how all the timelines intersect and how they all work together. And I get that. It's not what I find fun, but I get that because the depth of the mechanics is kind of there. But in Flip-Flop, yeah, you could understand like the mechanics of how the sex scandal affects the Slithergy politicking and how it all intersects with each other more over time. But like Is it worth it? Like, at least in Primer, it's got that big crazy timeline web you can work out if you watch it enough times. Here, it's almost like you're doing Morris's work for him by re-listening to it to understand it more. Am I being a huge hypocrite here? Because I do think there's a lot of, even if it's just to do with mechanics, I kind of get going over stories again and again to mine out the mechanically how they worked here. Why does it seem silly to me with this story?
I think in this case, it's kind of cheating because this story has no ending. I think the only reason it's infinite, you can go over it again is because it doesn't end. It just loops back into itself rather than actually resolving anything in a particularly satisfying manner. And also the mechanics of this story, as they're laid out, compared to something like Primer, they're not exactly that intricate, really. It's just the Doctor goes back in time and then goes forward in time and then goes back in time again. It's pretty simple,
Just the idea that this has never been done before as well. Like, in Doctor Who audio drama, yeah, sure. There's a lot of writers that are doing interesting stuff. And I look at other, like, big nerds who do kind of stick to their nerdy lanes, and they do make, kind of insular genre narratives, but they still accomplish a lot. Sometimes that is, if not seminal, then at least feels innovative enough in their own fields that they get a lot of depth to engage with. Like classic example I'm thinking of is like Kojima, who the stuff he makes is very steeped in genre, but it feels like there's a kind of innovation to it because he's got this grasping ambition for things larger than I think his peers in the genre kind of attempt. And I think a huge part of that is Kojima he's like Russell T Davies. He watches all sorts of shit. He watches, the biggest blockbusters all the time, but he also keeps up with, much more interesting things that are happening elsewhere. I think, like, for me, a novelist I really like is Paul Auster. And one of the wild things for me when I first played Metal Gear Solid 2, in my very early 20s, I think, was seeing, wait, he's referencing these, like, postmodern novels that I wouldn't expect, some Hollywood obsessive video game developer to know about. And he's referencing these and he's building stuff off these. And then later I learned he was meant to have characters named after them and everything. And I think what's happening there is he's reading and engaging so widely outside of his own genre world that when he innovates in his own genre space, it's not seminal in the sense that he's the first one to think of a narrative where X, Y, Z happens, but it feels semi-seminal in the sense that he is kind of doing stuff in that genre space, at least at that scale, that people haven't done yet because he's engaging widely. And I'm sure Johnny Morris engages with plenty of stuff outside of Doctor Who because I know I literally know he writes stuff that's got nothing to do with Doctor Who. He writes his own works and whatnot, and I'm sure he engages with all sorts of things. But the big hoo-ha over how seminal the idea of you can listen to this in a way that isn't linear just feels ridiculous to me to, like, make such a huge deal out of.
And I think the problem is almost that while it's so concerned with doing something no one's ever done before in that structural sense, the actual content of the story and the events are things that just feel incredibly just sort of played out and crap. Like, okay, you got some angry two-dimensional cardboard cutout freedom fighters running around and some sort of racist aliens running around and the Doctor and Mel just get dragged around and put in prison. It's so, like, played out and flat in terms of what's actually there.
This is something I wanted to bring up is Moffat. So Moffat gets a lot of hate for his convolutions and his windy, timey-wiminess he does, making time travel the point of stories rather than just like the vehicle of how a story gets to the setting or whatever. And a lot of people dislike how much focus Moffat puts on that. What distinguishes Moffat getting kind of windy and, as some would say, overcomplicated? And what distinguishes... It's better if we think of a Moffat story that isn't so successful. Like, what distinguishes something like The Wedding of River Song or The Name of the Doctor and their timey-wimey complications from something like this? Like, why do we find the complexities of this story irritating? Or why are we kind of looking down and kind of sneering a little bit at them when I imagine, like, I don't like The Wedding of River Song, but I don't really sneer at it? Why is that?
I think that something like The Wedding of River Song is at the very least attempting to, I guess, fulfill some kind of satisfying structure, even if it doesn't succeed in that all the way. It climaxes with a big emotional scene between the Doctor and River. It sort of resolves itself in a way. It's got conflict between the Doctor and trying to sort out this situation, which ultimately does get sorted out. And it's, for all that it's sort of a mess and a shambles, it's at least it's got some measure of respect for its audience's desire to see drama, rather than just a structure that is doing things because it can, if you see what I mean.
It's characterful, and it's not arbitrary. And it's interrogative of its own cleverness, I suppose you'd call it. Where there was that quote in the DVD case, in the little letter that you've got from Johnny, about how it's 2 stories for the price of 1, which really, if you think about the fact that the 2 discs are the same, it's half a story for the price of 1. Flip-Flop feels very small, I suppose is what I'm getting at. It feels like it's got this idea, and the whole story contrives to make this idea work. This structural gimmick is the whole point of the thing, and everything in it is there to make that structural gimmick work, which isn't what gimmicks are for, because that leaves you with a story that's just a gimmick, rather than what I would say on his best days Moffat does, which is using gimmicks as background or distractions or reinforcement for an actual story that's about characters and emotion and theme fundamentally, and that just uses the structural gimmickry to assist in the actual storytelling, where it doesn't feel like storytelling is the priority here.
Yeah.
That's basically what I would say. Is I don't really think Wedding or Name are, in my opinion, particularly good stories, but I do think they are stories that, there's characters and emotion and there's arcs in them. Flip-Flop to me feels like a technical exercise with bits of
unsavory, unpleasant.
It's not that. Bits of frankly, well, the story kind of oscillates between these embarrassing attempts at political commentary. I mean, we'll get to this clip later, but there's one clip where I literally put my head in my hands when I re-listened to the story this week, just because, Jesus, man, it's to think you've made a cool point in saying this, it just had me, on the edge. But there's bits of that, and there's bits where it's like outright heinous, which is like, I mean, Moffat has, said his own rotten things before and depicted his own rotten things, but, that's more in the sense of saying things people find unsavory politically, not outright, almost doing a call to action. Anyway, the last bit of promo stuff I want to look at is from the contemporary Doctor Who magazine around this story. And so there's interviews with all the related people, and there's a bit of art which we'll look at in a second, because, Jesus, but I want to look at the little interview bits first before we really dig into the story in depth. And so it's, it's Doctor Who magazine. It's 2 pages about the story. It's, saying what the story is. It's about blind and manipulative slugs. Blah, blah, blah. It's got a bunch of question marks. This is Johnny Morris's second audio after a more conventional, intentionally conventional story he did with the Silurians. Its innovation is that you can play the discs in either order and still get a joined up story. Morris says, "The first idea behind it was me thinking, what can I do in this medium that I couldn't do in any other? What's uniquely interesting about having plays across 2 CDs? Well, you could put the wrong CD in your player first. Certainly I'm always doing that and realizing my mistake about 20 minutes later. So this is making a virtue out of having a story in 2 identical looking sections. You can't tell which way round to play them. Not something you could do for radio drama. There was a simulcast on BBC Radio 2 and 4 once where you could switch between them as they aired, but that's not the same. Listeners get a 4-episode story with a beginning, middle and end. You get a proper opening with the Doctor and Mel emerging from the TARDIS and exploring. A proper ending... What is he talking about? You absolutely do not in either side. That's completely untrue. Anyway, that is completely untrue. How do you get a proper ending on either side?
Yeah, that's just a lie.
That's completely false. In no stretch of the imagination.
A proper ending in that they get in the box, I suppose. In the same way that it's a proper beginning when they get out of the box.
I also guess in both timelines you get the basically the doom that falls upon both versions of the world. So the big explosion that wipes out the colony on one side, and on the other side you get the Slivergy taking over the presidency and just taking over everything. So both, not a proper ending to the story, but certainly like a proper, a fate for everyone, a quite grim one.
It stops.
Yes, it stops.
So he says you get a proper ending when they leave and a cliffhanger halfway through. Once I was clear that I could do that, I emailed Gary Russell. Sidebar, Gary Russell, of course, was the man who basically creatively ran Big Finish before the modern era of Nicholas Briggs. I'm sure we all have thoughts on the differing reigns of those two men, but that's not what we're talking about today. He emailed Gary Russell and Gary's response was, "That's a brilliant idea, write it. A very positive thing to have before the story stage. So I, Johnny, thought, what else can I do? You could explore parallel universes or do one disc as a backstage version of another." Sidebar, later Big Finish audios would do that successfully. I'm thinking of Nev Fountain here. Anyway, not this one. He says, "The challenge I set myself was to tell the story every possible way." Morris laughs. "If anyone else tries it, they'll have to rip me off. My favourite thing, having a joke where either way round you get a punchline." Sidebar, both of you seen the original version of Arrested Development Season 4?
Yes.
No.
That's I just think that's the it's a fantastic example of what he's talking about there, where you have jokes that actually will work in different orders and jokes that retroactively become jokes and basically non-linear jokes. No one watched the modern recut of the season, which removes all of that. The original version of Arrested Development Season 4 does what Morris is talking about there brilliantly. Jokes that are completely non-linear and work because of the format. Highly recommend. Anyway, Morris says, "But that's just the format, not what it's about. I had the opportunity to tell a story that's about alternatives, about choices. Possibly like my book's Festival of Death and Arachnophobia. It's about people trying to change their past. But this one's saying, yes, you can do that, no problem, without it becoming paradoxical. It's very mathematical," he says. "Cause and effect still work. There are no unexplained incidents. So that's my wonderful science fiction idea."
Interesting, he mentions it's a story about choices, but I'm pretty sure pretty much every fucking story in the history of fiction is about choices. Certainly every story with characters in it.
We often, not always, but we often give the benefit of the doubt to Chibnall, and we at least extend the thought that maybe this was a cock-up rather than malevolence. I don't extend that here, because he's actively calling it political. When we talked about The Unquiet Dead, we talked at length about the way the story functions as malevolent. And we explored at depth what Lawrence Miles had to say about how he sees the story as more directly malevolent than a lot of fans, even a lot of those who despise the refugee narrative that ends up in the episode. But with The Unquiet Dead, Mark Gatiss wasn't swanning around saying, I've done something no one has done before, and I've written the political diatribe to end all political diatribes. And, I've said something awfully clever about, invaders into the country here. He wasn't selling the story like that. He was selling it as, I love Doctor Who and I cried when I heard them saying Gelf, and I love Victoriana and I like death a lot. He was... You can find what Gatiss did evil, and you could read into it, you could argue, some of the storytelling in the climax was, latent assumptions he had or thoughts he has, and you could, talk about liberalism and blah, blah, blah with that. But you're having to read something into there to get to that point, aren't you? And, Lawrence Miles did, successfully or unsuccessfully, but you have to kind of go a little bit extra to kind of read that into it. Like the Gelf reading is right there, like Oliver talked about how his housemates, saw it on first viewing the episode. But I don't think the reading that Gatiss was puffing up his chest and saying, refugees, you just wait for what I have to show on the telly tonight. But for Morris, he talks up the story so much. He talks up, how seminal it is and how political it is. And then the story itself is so diseased. It's so heinous. In Unquiet Dead is uncomfortable stuff in it, and it has things I think are rotten in it. But they're basically in the climax. They're not for 2 hours, are they? Here, we're going to listen to a whole range of clips a little bit later in this discussion and actively go through this, but do you know what I mean? I don't have any respect for this story, and so I don't have respect for the writing of it, because I think it's a really terrible story, and I think it's something terrible to exist as well. So I don't know.
Unquiet Dead has mitigating factors.
Yeah.
This has none. There's really nothing to redeem Flip Flop at all.
If I'm watching something like Olympia, at least it's brilliant how it's been made, technically and aesthetically. You know, it's a stunning set of films, how it looks at least. And obviously there's so much rotten there. Like, that's completely obvious, you know, in so many senses. And we can talk so much about the creator of the film. But at least it has the decency to be really good formalistically and aesthetically. That's why I'm inclined to be antagonistic about this story.
The difference is that I think The Unquiet Dead is structurally quite anti-refugee, in that the structure of the story happens to get to a point, mostly unintentionally, if you think intention's important, but the nature of the structure of, you know, Doctor Who stories and Doctor Who as an institution and British culture at the time gets you to a point where it has a xenophobic message. Flip Flop is structurally anti-refugee in that the entire structure of the thing is built to be anti-refugee. It's been constructed from the ground up to be this diatribe, like you said.
I think also, even if I thought that the form tied into the themes better, like, I would still be very antagonistic and frankly ruder to this story, like I have been, than I am to pretty much every other story we've talked about, even if it was done better formalistically, because I think the malevolence of this story is so much more so, you know, than something like The Unquiet Dead, and then, you know, then the Chibnall stories we talk about as well, all of them. But it's not, and so it's just like, it's kind of begging for a cavalcade of negativity, basically. If this was really good formalistically, we would still be negative, but the fact that it's not just makes it kind of a joke to discuss in some ways.
And I expect Oliver will agree with me here, but I think even draining the racism aspect out of the story, I think the form aspect is also kind of evil as well. I think this will maybe become clear when we talk about it more, but I think that what the form is doing with this loop story, and what Morris says about choices and things, I think there is like you say, like a centrism there, and basically a defeatist, really crap attitude to life that can be read across the whole story. In a sense, he talks about writing a story that's about choices and, you know, trying to change the past, but in each case, the characters who are doing that are so two-dimensional and shallow and crude that basically the story doesn't become about, you know, the theme of trying to make choices or change, but just about characters being really ridiculous and sucking and bad and then dying stupidly, senseless deaths for no particular reason.
Again, I don't want to imply he doesn't read widely or he didn't read widely at the time, because I honestly expect he probably was reading all sorts of interesting stuff and watching all sorts of interesting stuff. But the way he talks up the seminal nature of the story and the way the whole promo plays into it, it just makes me like cringe, basically, to see the execution of it. It's like Shearman is self-effacing to a fault. Like, I think Robert Shearman plays his stories down significantly too much. It actually frustrates me because I think I'll never forget in the comments section for an Elizabeth Sandifer TARDIS Eruditorium piece, some commenter was taking Robert Shearman to task for having pet themes and for doing stories in similar structures. And Shearman, this sticks with me so much. Shearman was like kind of sad about it. Like, he was like, man, you're right. And I'm sorry about that, man. You know, like, that's, maybe I shouldn't write. And he wasn't doing this in like a guilty way. He was doing this in what read to me as an extremely sincere way. He's like saying, maybe I should write Doctor Who less because, you know, clearly this style isn't really working. Then people don't want to see the same stuff over again. Maybe this works more in books for writers to do the same themes again. And I'm there like ripping my hair out like, fuck, this, you know, you've got a writer writing real stuff in a real way here in Doctor Who. And I know it's just one commenter on, you know, a website, but to still the mere thought to turf someone out for writing, it's you know, it's like the same stuff that Moffat sometimes gets castigated for. It's that you're a writer and you write about the same things. This is This is insanity.
I think the fact Shearman showed up in the comment section of that post to reply to the criticism of him, I think says everything about why we shouldn't bully Shearman in that way, because that's how he'll respond. He'll take it to heart.
That's my perennial. I love Doctor Who so much. I'm not one of those, I hate Doctor Who and I say that as a fan people at all. I think it's fantastic. I think the whole underlying premise and structure of it is for the most part really good, I think. And I think it's usually executed to a good level and occasionally to a fantastic level. I like Doctor Who sincerely. I'm not someone who sticks around with this franchise with the thought that maybe one day they'll do it right, and they haven't done it yet. I think the show's been great multiple times, and I think in other forms it's great, even semi-often. But to listen to a story like this... Is it that a story like this kind of makes you question your faith in Doctor Who as a concept? If this is what people consider... No, it doesn't actually. No? There was a story that did that earlier in the year. I remember complaining about it. There was an audio box set earlier in the year that actually did make me go, fuck, what do I... yeah. There was they weren't offensive to me, and I don't think they were malevolent in the slightest, but there was a set of audios, a box set in 4 parts, written by 2 writers, each having 2 stories each, which I listened to earlier in the year, which, like Flip Flop, I'd had talked up to me for years, and so I assumed it was going to be quite good. And I found it so bad, specifically in ways that briefly dispirited me about everything Doctor Who. I got over it, within the day. But sometimes you do listen to stories that, are so bad that they kind of make you question. But no, I love Doctor Who. And equally, sometimes you engage with a Doctor Who story that's so good, it lifts you up and you like Doctor Who even more. But I think that's when stories tend to play in the more expected Doctor Who sandboxes. I think a story like Heaven Sent isn't going to make you think, man, Doctor Who as a whole is just brilliant and I can't wait to go and watch more Doctor Who episodes, because it's kind of its own thing. It's a very unique episode. And so too with Flip Flop, I feel like it's a very unique thing. And so it being bad doesn't make me think, man, Big Finish suck. This whole era of Big Finish sucks. It doesn't at all, because this is very much its own thing. I think it's when something is more typical Doctor Who and then it's either really good or really bad, leads you to either, puff up and really champion the Doctor Who even more, or briefly kind of question your devotion to it. Yeah, does that make sense? Or is this just me that engages with Doctor Who that way?
No, yeah. Girl Who Died, I through the Chibnall era, was having a bit of a rough time with the thing. Then I went back and watched The Girl Who Died, and it wasn't the first good episode I had seen, but it was so of the type. It's doing Doctor Who in an exciting and invigorating way. And it made me go, oh yeah, that's why I like this show. Yeah.
I think unique stories like this, just you judge on their own things more. It's like when we were talking about Unquite Dead, and I was talking a bit about how I don't love in Doctor Who, that thing you thought wasn't an alien, it was an alien. And that frustrates me a bit, and that sends me into Torchwood's arms a bit, where, the 5th episode of Torchwood did the opposite of that. And it's, it said there are these fairy things and, they've been around for a long time. We don't really understand them. And that was it. The episode ended and they didn't really understand them. And there was no, they're Vogons from the planet Galaxy and they move that way because, they're using the bio things inside them and they blah, blah, blah. It's all very dispiriting and technological. It just ended, that was kind of fantastical and we never get that explained. Jack has a few ideas what it could be, but it's left alone. And that lights my little heart up because I love that ambiguity and I love, when a story could be something or it could be something else. It could be magic, it could be angels, it could be the Gelth. I like that when the thing is open. That's one of the things I like about Torchwood more than Doctor Who. The relevance to Flip Flop there is just that when the writer is saying this is a political satire, and I meant it to be about this, he's doing himself a disservice. At least someone like Peter Harness will sometimes go, well, I wasn't really trying to do XYZ, but it's cool, or it's, you read that into that. That's great. Sometimes I roll my eyes a bit at a writer saying, I don't know what I intended by that. You read into it. When I'm like, come on. But it's always preferable to someone saying, yes, it was XYZ. Enjoy it or don't. Back to Morris in Doctor Who magazine. He says, compared to his Silurian audio, so the audio he wrote before this was called Blood Tide with Colin Baker. And he says, Blood Tide was me writing the most traditional Doctor Who story I could. Exactly what I'd have liked to watch in 1986. Flip-flop is the complete opposite the complete opposite of that approach. It's me being extraordinarily meticulous and pedantic with every single scene's contents and characters. Each disc should even have the same number of scenes.
Why?
And then he talks a bit about how it's always a mystery which side he wrote first. He would later clarify which side he wrote first. And he ends this Doctor Who magazine piece on the story by saying, I really wanted a story where you'd have to listen at least twice to get all of it, both ways round. I've put in tiny references so that you could listen 3 or 4 times and keep getting things out of it. In fact, on every single draft I wrote, I alternated where I started from. There wasn't even a fixed starting point.
You don't even have to watch it in order.
It's extremely not that complicated. Once you get to the end of the first disc, whichever you listen to, you know absolutely how the whole thing works. Which makes the second disc really drag.
Yeah.
Because you've got it at that point. You go, oh, they go back, change time, and it makes the other timeline. Cool.
The fact that he was so meticulous about even having the same number of scenes on each disc, even though that doesn't actually need to be the case, I think...
Not at all.
Really weird. He seems to have sort of written himself into... Well, not even writing it. He just seems to have decided arbitrarily that these 2 discs have to be just so ridiculously similar. Like genuinely interchangeable. Like he seems like, because of the format is like they can literally be interchanged in terms of which ones you start with, he seems to have interpreted that as they can also be interchangeable in terms of content, which is just begging the question, why are you doing this? Why you make us sit through this?
It reminds me of, people who think, oh, you can watch these 2 episodes of Twin Peaks at the same time. You overlay one on the other and it all fits together. And it's like, it's a really... that's not what happened, but it's this really complicated technical thing where they have to work out the number of scenes, but that's not what's going on here. So I don't understand why he thought, why did he have to do the exact same number of scenes? Why did he have to make each side of the story like incredibly structurally similar? I don't get it. Like, I get that you can listen to either side, and I get that they show, what if this happened versus what if that happens, but like, what is the actual point of, well, Mel makes a pop culture reference at this point, and it's a different pop culture reference, but at this precise point, she makes a pop culture reference. Like, why did he have to do that?
I think what it seems to be saying is that even though the 2 worlds are different, the characters do the same things and basically function the same way. So it's almost like that Chibesque essence thing. Like, the nature of who these characters are cannot change, even if the entire last 30 years of history has changed. And even if Mel and the Doctor land in a totally different world, they will do the same things and be exactly as useless in the exact same way. It's like this insistence that nothing can be different, nothing can be like in flux. Everything has to just be one way, and you can't change who you are, you can't change society or anything like that.
There's an interesting implication, because the whole story's nested within another unseen story, right? They're on a side quest fighting some quarks or whatever. And the implication is that they arrive here, one of 2 events happens, and then they leave. And that's a self-contained little paradox where 2 versions of events could have happened, and it ends with them leaving the same way. But the implication of that, if you want to buy that going back to the Quark adventure, things carry on and the 2 timelines sort of knit back together. The implication there is that the 2 varying versions of events had exactly the same impact on the Doctor and Mel. Nothing changed for them personally. And by sort of the laws of time travel, they have to be exactly the same people leaving this adventure either way around. Which, again, demonstrates the whole thing that good and bad things are exactly the same. There's 0 difference between them. Whether you try to do something or not, it's all the same. All the same either way. Both sides are the same.
It's like an admission that characters don't matter in this story. It's not about characterization or drama in any way. The Doctor and Mel leave and it's exactly the same. No effect on them whatsoever. No nothing.
And the fact that they hit the same lines either time makes it very clear that the characters aren't saying things because it's what they would say in that situation. They're saying those things because it's the bit in the script where they say those things. There's no reason you would have to have the 2 discs be almost identical, except that it's easier to write. It would be a lot more interesting if they contrived differently to connect into each other rather than just being the same events twice.
This makes all the vaunting of the form of the story just seem even more ridiculous to me, because it's like saying, well, I did all my homework with my left hand instead of my right hand, and I'm right-handed. It's like, well, no one gives a shit. Like, why did you do that to yourself? Like, you didn't have to make it so hard for yourself. And in fact, you making it so hard for yourself almost seems a bit like it's kind of like it justifies the story's own dullness, isn't it? Well,
yeah.
Well, because, it's the same on both sides. But it didn't have to be. You could have done all your big ideas. You could have done your big anti-refugee, horseshoe theory, great replacement shit. You could have done all of that while not having Mel say the exact same thing at the exact same time on both tracks. Like, it's weird to me. I don't understand why he did this. Like, was it actually easier to organize it this way? Because it seems like it made for such it's just boring. Like, I think for me, I remember the first time I listened to it, and when I re-listened to it this week, when I started the second side, and I realized, oh yeah, it is the exact same on both sides. It's just kind of, my shoulders slump, and I'm like, well, that's the next hour. It's the same thing as the last hour.
Yeah, it's going through the motions.
Yeah.
And ironically, even though the whole premise is that the future has changed radically and it's horrible in a new way now, it still plays out in a way that feels incredibly similar. So almost the two different futures feel interchangeable in a way that actually kind of just makes the story boring and sort of neutralizes everything.
What I want to look at right now is a picture. So Doctor Who magazine, back in the early days of the Big Finish monthlies, it used to do these usually like 3-panel illustrations, like little comics, like comic previews for each of the audios, which is so cool. So even an audio, like even some very non-visual ones of Robert Shearman's, they even got illustrations, and you could see the artists having to think outside the box to how are we going to illustrate a story that's about sound. So it was so cool that Doctor Who magazine, and they still do illustrations, but not like this, not like these really comic-y hand-drawn ones. And so the illustration we got for Flip Flop is, I'll get it up for everyone, is this. So it's actually a scene that takes place before both sides of the story. So it's like a little tiny prequel, I guess you could say. So it's the Slithergy arriving. And, the actual dialogue in this is some human at the control panel saying some sort of alien spaceship has arrived in orbit. They're claiming to be refugees. And then there's the I can't describe it. The Slithergy in all as it looks says, "We humbly beg to be permitted to reside on the first moon." And then you've got the Doctor and Mel running, "Quick, Mel, back to the TARDIS." Why? I'll explain later when we aren't being shot at. For anyone just listening to this in podcast form, I can't describe the Slithergy. It's where to begin. So in the audio itself, they're just described as blind slugs pretty much, aren't they?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
But on the cover art and in this comic panel, and I don't want to single out the artist too much because it could very well have been, something from Big Finish saying, make him look like this, or, give him the red eyes, or give him the big nose, that could have come from Big Finish. So I don't want to castigate the cover artist I mentioned earlier, but they're very human in their faces. They look like big, disheveled, ugly, misshapen slugs. And in this comic, it's got a cane. And their faces...
Yeah, they're sort of, the top half of them is human, and then they turn into slugs in the bottom half.
Yeah.
It's puzzling because it's not clear why they need to have any humanoid aspect to them at all, because, they don't, it's not like they point... It's not like they do a lot of humanoid things in the story, they just talk. So it seems like a real deliberate choice to give them the pointy ears and the hooked nose and all this shit. Yeah.
I see some people say their faces are reminiscent of Gandhi, and they say that's what's weird about their faces, is that they look like Gandhi. But I see most people who take an issue with how they look say, these look like weirdly anti-Semitic caricatures. And, what the fuck? Why do they look like this?
Yeah.
They're never described like this in the story. Where did this come from?
And Morris himself says that in his imagination they were just giant slugs.
Yeah, even Morris is like, what the fuck with this element?
Yeah. But the thing is, I you can see how you get to this art from the text itself,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
There's so much there's so much racial nastiness and specifically anti-Semitism sort of baked into them as monsters that I can see how an artist makes them like this.
The story is essentially about these. Well, there's some semantic dispute over whether they're minorities, but minorities that basically control politics and the media and assert like an innate victimhood that lets them take tremendous control over the civilization. And so to hear that and then to look at this cover, which is human for some reason, and then, which a lot of people read as looking like anti-Semitic caricatures, it's just like, even for Morris to go, whoa, I didn't really mean them to look like that. It's like, but you wrote them as such an ugly kind of, whatever you were writing them as was trading in real cultural associations. And I'm not saying the story itself necessarily was, directly trading in anti-Semitic tropes. I'm not saying Morris came into the story specifically trying to do that, but the story is specifically trading in very direct political associations, like this idea of, there's a, they literally talk about their own ethnic experience. And so we've got a specific ethnicity which asserts an essential victimhood, and then through that gains control of the media and the politicians of the world. And so I'm not saying that necessarily leads directly into anti-Semitism, but I don't think Morris gets to wash his hands of it because he's trading in tropes that there's other racist ways they can be read, but anti-Semitism is a pretty intuitive one, at least for British listeners. I don't mean it like that, but I mean like in Britain, that's a pretty normalized association to pull out of the things Morris is putting into the story.
It's like a grab bag. Any racism you want to take out of this story, you can, because it's all just bunched up in there. Big old racist snowball.
That's what's interesting to me, that people pull Gandhi out of it sometimes. And so then it's like they're going after like the obsequious, we say we come in peace, but we're actually, I don't really know what the connotation there is meant to be. But you can see that depending on your own flavor of what you're going to read into it, you can get a different form of why is the cover art so racist in this specific way out of it. And that's how this story is presented to you. On Spotify, the CD, the Doctor Who magazine preview, you're seeing this depiction before you listen to it for most listeners. So it sure sets the tone.
On the specifically anti-Semitic readings, obviously most of it is more sort of broadly anti-refugee stuff, but they talk about, the Slithergees talk about the fact that they're victimized in the whole universe, and every culture that they've come into contact with has been hostile against them. And, I wonder whose fault that is, right? Which is the most classically anti-Semitic talking point you get.
What? But my understanding is this is actually a really epic way to own the Daily Mail, because we've got a really anti-Semitic image on the cover, and then we trade in these anti-Semitic tropes pretty directly through the story. So that's satire. We're doing something really progressive by doing that. So when we're really racist, but we don't think we're racist, that's called epic satire. That's what that is.
It's satire because we present the racist viewpoint.
We're not a racist, so it's satire. So it's really cool, actually.
Yeah, and we're not a racist because we're satirizing racism by doing the racism.
Exactly. It's just a prank, bro.
Which isn't even... which is a wild way to defend the story, because that's not even what Morris says, right?
Yeah.
He talks about how it's a genuine sort of devil's advocate argument against the excesses of political correctness.
Yeah.
And it's on the Daily Mail side. It's not only on the Daily Mail side, and there's a bit of flip-flopping, as I'm sure we'll get to. But it presents those arguments unironically.
Yeah, I mean, the whole thing is, it's ripped so much, like so many terms from the headline, so to speak. So terms like hate crime and, a downtrodden minority. Interesting, like the Slithergees are described to...
Affirmative action, they say.
Yeah, positive discrimination, that's the one, yes. It ruins the society. It's pretty much as explicit as you can get. Another thing for the grab bag of racism, they mentioned the Slithergees have a community leader, which again is kind of a term that is often sort of deployed in sort of media coverage of like Islamic communities in Britain. It's like, it's just this whole idea of just, they really get explicit as they possibly can about making the racism parallels with the Slithergees. I mean, there is just no way around it.
Yeah, on the intersection between the anti-Semitic and Islamophobic readings on them, which they sit right in that intersection.
This is the story's richness, the multiplicity of racisms you can read into it.
Yeah, the layers of it. It can be two things at once, flip-flopping between them. The beauty. No, it really emphasizes the point that the liturgies are replacing Christmas. They're doing a war on Christmas, and they're replacing it with their own alien festivities, a different culture near Christmas, and they want you saying happy holidays instead. It's that tension between a presumed Christian audience and alien outsiders who don't celebrate Christmas. Ooh. And the story doesn't care about Christmas.
No.
The rest of it's not about Christmas. It is just there to go, ooh, it's under attack. It's a purely negative version of Christmas.
Our values are under attack.
Yeah.
I want to think about this in like a humanistic way. I think with this would-be satire stuff, I think most people listening to this could probably relate to a situation where, especially like being a teenager in school, especially where like if you're a woman and there's some guy or group of guys that are being really sexist and, you know, like maybe there's some discomfort. Someone's like, what the hell? And they're like, well, you know, we're just joking. We don't actually think women belong in the kitchen and should make me a sandwich. We're just joking about it. And then they say it again. And it's like, well, or you know, people do the same thing with racism. They'll like say a racist word, or they'll, you know, they'll joke in quotation marks with some racist trope. And then, well, you know, we're just joking, bro. You know, you know, we like you. It's just a joke. You know, or if you're not conforming to, you know, a traditional vision of masculinity or femininity, and, you know, there's all these jokes about they could be transphobic or just, you know, calling you a sissy or whatever, you know, other term for women the other way around or whatever. And then if you ask, you know, what the hell or whatever, it's, well, we're joking, you know, we're not actually castigating you. We're not actually offending you. It's just a joke. You know, so we're saying the racist thing, we're saying the sexist thing, but then our mouths are saying it's just a joke after it. So you can't be offended because we said it was a joke. It's this kind of thing. And I think that's what so many people receive satire as these days, or they think that's what satire means, is that, oh, so I can say that word. I just have to laugh about it after and be like, well, I'm not, you know, obviously I'm not a racist, you know, so I can say the word because I'm joking. Wouldn't it be crazy if I was a racist and I said that word? So I said the word, but, you know, I'm not a racist. So it was actually a satirical way of saying the word. It's like, what? What's going on? No, you are just being racist. You are just being sexist. You are just being transphobic. It's just like they've figured out, I found this secret Monopoly card that gets me the free money. You know, if I say it's a joke, or, you know, I say I'm being satirical, therefore I can say all these things. And it doesn't matter, you know, whether deep down I really am not a racist. Like, what does it mean? You're functioning as a racist because you're saying racist things and it's offending, you know, people of a different race than you and it's hurting them. And so what does it mean for you to say a couple of words where you go, it was a joke? Like, what does that mean? This story is that exact thing to me. It's like, oh, it was a political satire. The story is, it's completely and utterly through its core anti-refugee, and it's trading in all these anti-refugee tropes very uncritically. And the most you can read into it is, you know, that sometimes it lays it on thick with him saying, I, the undemocratically elected leader, say blah, blah, blah. But what does that achieve? How does that make this, how does this make, you know, a refugee feel better about it? Like, what is the actual satire here? It's this just complete misinterpretation of what satire means. Satire is directed. One
of the other things in that long hyphenated list, he also mentions it's a comedy, right? And whenever we get those awful lines where the liturgy say, it's our ethnic experience being minimized, and you know, use one of those terms to blatantly just sort of cynically undermine the humans and just, you know, avariciously take stuff for themselves and such. I think that's supposed to be, in some twisted sense, the comedy. Because if you're like some, you know, charred Big Finish customer and you hear that, you're like, oh, ha, ha, that's so true. So true. I think it's one of those stories where just a racist can listen to it and just be like, wow, so true. This is just like what's happening in real life. Isn't that like silly? I think that's supposed to be the comedy element. Like the thing being satirized is the whole concept of, not being racist to people, and it's just mocking that basically because, well, really, if you go too far with tolerance, then actually you'll just ruin everything, and you're just giving those horrible, filthy alien people too many rights. It's just diseased, yes.
There was a Reductress headline today, which was, wow, man being ironically sexist is also normal sexist. That's it. That's the thing. People use the irony as a way of saying the thing they already believe, and it gives you a bit of obfuscation where you can go, well, I don't really, or, whether or not I mean it, I might just be asking questions, I might just be joking. But everyone listening knows, I said the thing I agree with.
There's an interview with Morris where he says, this is from the modern day now. And so he does say self-awarely, some of the politics work and some of the politics don't work in the story. But he says he thinks the whole point of the whole exercise was the idea that, you can't judge the past based on what you think might have been. The idea of if Chamberlain hadn't appeased Hitler, would things have been better? Was he a bad leader for that or a good leader for that? And Morris is just sort of going, well, if you could travel into these other versions of history, would it be better or would it be worse? It's, one version of history.
Who can say?
And then he talks about his horseshoe thing of, on one side they're terrorists and on one side they're like fascist policemen. And so there's all this stuff. I'm doing these big, thought-provoking things about refugees and, I'm making these huge statements about politics and history. Who the fuck are you? You're a Doctor Who writer. What do you know? Like, I'm being very serious there. This is something that really annoys me with so many genre things, is when these genre writers get on these huge high horses and it's like they making these huge theses about politics and society and about really touchy things specifically to do with race. Who are you? What do you have to teach me? What are you actually illuminating here? How do you know any of this? Like, what is your actual viewpoint here? How is it an informed one? What do you know about Chamberlain and Hitler? What do you know about... Do you know what I mean? I just feel like I'm wasting my time listening to this because what do you know? And you talk yourself up about the form and you haven't even read enough to know that you're not actually the first person to do this. And so it's just the arrogance of telling stories like this just disconnects me so much because what are you talking about? Like these big theses you're trying to make. From what perspective are you saying this? What sort of historical knowledge do you have? What racial knowledge do you have? What political knowledge do you have? Who is he to say this?
When he's tut-tutting about people who think that history might be different or better if someone hadn't made a particular decision or a particular thing hadn't happened, it's that whole just world fallacy nonsense, isn't it? Because essentially he's like trying to argue against the entire concept of interpreting or analysing or criticising people's decisions in history or looking at the consequences of things and saying, this thing, it was bad that this happened. He's tut-tutting at people for saying that. Because, well, actually, if that hadn't happened, then maybe things would be even worse. Ooh, you just don't know, do you? And of course we don't know, because all kinds of other factors might happen. But nonetheless, that doesn't mean we shouldn't just think about how things that happened may have been bad and maybe shouldn't have happened. And maybe we might have had more access to better outcomes if something hadn't happened. I mean, it's just this whole anti-intellectual mindset that just wants us to stop thinking critically about things at all and just accept how things just spooled out.
If we're interrogating the author's mindset in writing this, I want to read out, there's an illuminating interview from back in the day about Morris's mindset with this kind of thing. The interviewer asks him about how he's written 2 Doctor Who novels set in different eras. So tell us what your perfect Doctor Who novel would be. And he says, perfect written by me or by someone else, I'm not sure. I have quite contradictory tastes in Doctor Who, and I don't think any book could accommodate them. The answer is, of course, a perfect Doctor Who novel would give me the same feeling, that same level of excitement that I used to get watching Doctor Who back in the late 70s and early 80s. That same buzzy feeling I got sitting down to watch Tomb of the Cybermen and the Pyramids of Mars on video for the first time. Something that could create that thrill, that anticipation. But I don't think it's possible, sadly, because I'm not the person I was back in the late 70s and early 80s. I'm too jaded and cynical and possibly not capable of the same level of joy that I was then. When you're a kid, you accept what you're given, you don't question it, you just marvel. As an adult, I read things and spend half my time trying to work out how the story works and looking for subtexts and themes and dramatic mechanisms and things. I don't know. And then on his idea of the perfect Doctor Who novel, he says, get Lawrence Miles to come up with some ideas, keep the good ones, get Justin Richards, in to do the first draft to get the structure right and create some plot twists. Get Lance Parkin, Astra's favourite author, in to do some metafictional business over the top. Sprinkle a bit of Cornell and Allman throughout. Lloyd Rose gets to do the opening paragraph. Gary Russell gets to flesh out the companions. Steve Lyons handles continuity issues. And then get Gareth Roberts to go through and rewrite the whole thing from scratch. And then just throw it out. Then just throw it away and reincarnate bloody Douglas Adams and get him to write it instead. And so, the vision of, the perfect Doctor Who would be the Doctor Who that gives me the warm fuzzies that I was as a kid. This is the sort of person with the stature and the authority to give us the dirt on how this whole refugee business works and how the left and right really function. This is the perspective we all have to learn from. It's the white Doctor Who writers in the early 2000s in Britain. They understand what's going on with the refugee crises, and they understand, the political left and the political right, and the surprising similarity between them.
That's the thing. The Big Finish audio world is such a niche of a niche, like a niche within a niche. It's just this incredibly small and often insular environment.
And we were talking about form and how this is straining and struggling and wheezing and groaning to try and make its own conceit work, and that it doesn't work because the hours are very boringly just repeats of each other. The same interview asks Morris, how different was the process of writing his first Big Finish audio, which wasn't this one, it was the Silurian one, as opposed to your BBC novels? And he talks about, audio is all dialogue. Each line needs to be sayable, to sound natural, to define character, to follow on from the preceding to follow on from the preceding line, to define motivation, to illustrate environment, to advance the plot, to highlight themes and subtexts, to maintain pace, and so on. To draw a musical analogy, writing prose is like composing a piece for piano when you perform yourself. Script writing is like composing a piece for an orchestra to play for you. You don't have the same level of control, but you have other people adding to your work. And that's a really joyful process. And also he says again, the point is to tell a story that could only be told, he's talking about Flip Flop here, that could only be told on the medium of 2 CDs, and to use the medium in a new and interesting way, to tell a story that couldn't be told as a book or a TV show or even as a radio or internet broadcast, to try and do something that has never been done before in literature ever, as far as I'm aware.
It's fascinating. His when he talks about how this could only be done in this specific medium with 2 CDs, and he seems to be couching that entirely in that experience of him mixing up the CDs in the case when he puts it into the audio player, rather than the actual essence of it, which is the idea of having 2 things that you can do in either order. I mean, really, if you print in a book and just put a note at the start saying you can read chapter 2 before chapter 1, that's serving essentially the same purpose. It's just not physically realised in 2 separate, similar-looking CDs. So it really is in the most superficial sense that he is conceiving of this whole unique format thing.
He concedes that in many years' time. Eventually, in the future, he does concede that it could have worked as a book.
Good.
But he didn't. He did it back then.
The discs do give you the sort of visual image of 2 sides of a coin. Black side of the coin, white side of the coin, both of them the same, which again ties into the whole grass is greener politics.
Maybe they should reissue it on vinyl, like one side, side A, side B.
Yeah, redo the cover art, hand painted. On the politics of time travel, as we were talking about, something I think about a lot of the time. That idea that changing the past is inherently wrong because it will have unknown consequences frustrates me so fundamentally, because you know what also has unforeseen consequences? Doing stuff in the present. You don't know what's gonna happen. You don't angst over, giving away some money or treating someone kindly or saving someone's life in the present because one day it might spark and that person might be Hitler, so let's never do anything good for anyone because who knows where it might lead. It's such a using the medium of time travel to make that conservative point that you should never do anything, never try to change anything, never take any action that might change anything at all because it might change things in a bad way. you know what, everything changes things and it's always out of our control, so do the thing right now which seems like the best thing to do based on your information.
What you're saying, I think, synthesizes Gig's frustration with the just world fallacy elements of the story and my frustration with the, well, who are you to make any of these claims? You know, who are you to say any of this shit? Because it betrays that fundamental vision of the world, doesn't it? This vision of stasis. You know, it's effectively, you know, you don't change things because, you know, I can't even articulate the moral of the story. Well, how would you articulate the moral of this story?
Just because you think things could be better doesn't actually mean that they can, and also you should just die probably and give up on life. I don't know.
Yeah, well, it's interesting for how right-wing this story is, that it's fundamentally actually very centrist. Because it goes, there's a fascist timeline and a PC woke timeline, and they're both just as bad as each other. And anyone in either timeline who has any...
It's such a compelling idea, they made it into a video game called Bioshock Infinite years and years ago.
Hey,
just as stupid there. Even with the whole idea of this is why you shouldn't change history, they don't articulate it or argue it very well in this story, because whenever the Stuart and Lee figures go back in time to change the past, they always end up doing something additional which actually causes the problem. It's something additional to what they intended to do. So, for example, when they go back and assassinate the president on the Black Disc, freedom fighter Stuart also makes sure to frame the secretary, right? And it's him doing that ends up causing the whole Slithergy war mess shit, right? So it's not actually about how, hey, changing history is bad. It's how changing history in this wrong and very stupid way is bad.
Yeah.
And something similar happens on the other disc where, like, they don't just kill the secretary, they also persuade the president to do this, otherwise it will be a war timeline. And that ends up causing her fixation on appeasing the Slithergies and such and such and such. So it's like, it doesn't even very coherently argue its own point particularly well. It just fails at everything. By dint of the characters being just so contrived and, yeah.
That's it, it's the contrivance. We mentioned Puxatawny earlier. The name of the planet? Colony? Which is obviously taken from Groundhog Day. It's the name of the town in Groundhog Day. So the whole thing's gesturing at this infinite loop. And the whole point of the Groundhog Day story is that a person stuck in their ways gets physically stuck in their ways in a time loop and has to learn to change to get out of that stuck in their waysness, right? But taking that name and applying it here takes away the part of the story that's actually about learning to change and getting out of that stasis, and is literally just there to say, look, it's looping forever, nothing will ever change, and that's the point of this story.
It's incredibly dark and just bleak in just a really insane way. I think when I first listened to this, finishing it, I think I listened to Black first and White second, and on the White disc is where all the versions of Stuart and Lee are, you know, die horribly and pointlessly and senselessly, and that's it, that's the end, and Doctor and Mel just fuck off. I was just really stunned at how, in creating this eternal loop story of senseless death and hopelessness and tragedy, and just having it just blithely presented like that, but being so fixated on the cleverness of having it be in a loop, that the horror of it being that loop is almost glossed over. I was just staggered at just how fucking miserable that is. It's like, it's just as you say, in taking out the bit of Groundhog Day that's actually hopeful, you just have a story that is just completely and utterly fatalistic in a way I don't think anything else in Doctor Who really is. There is just no hope of progress or like positive development in any possible direction.
The two big things I still want to go through are some clips from the story so listeners can, it's a story that has to be heard to be believed. And then I also want to go through some of Morris's more recent comments on Twitter from the late 2010s. So some of his more contemporary, some revisions, and some other things he has to say about the story.
I think it makes sense to do the text itself first, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, let's do that. So I got a couple of clips to go through, and we've touched on some of this stuff, but some of it we haven't, and it just makes sense to go direct to the source. So the first clip, I'm going the white side and then the black side. So the first clip is from the first quarter, white 1, track 3 from the Big Finish version.
About 30 years ago, their spaceship appeared in orbit. Their home planet had been destroyed. They were refugees.
Refugees who travelled in a heavily armed battle cruiser.
They delivered an ultimatum to our president, Bailey. She could either give them one of our moons or risk starting a war.
And so she decided to start a war?
No. Before she had a chance to negotiate, she was murdered by one of their agents.
And you retaliated.
We had no choice.
Just like that? Did no one speak out against it?
My father did. He was executed for saying that Puxatawny would have been a nicer place to live if we'd given the Slithergees what they'd wanted.
But you won in the end, I take it.
At great cost. The Slithergees left our planet a poisonous wasteland. Nothing can survive out there.
It's one of two. On both discs, you get my dad got executed just for saying, and on this one, it's we shouldn't have gone to war. And on the other disc, it's my dad got executed just for saying that the Slithergees are bad.
These days, if you say you're English, you get sent to jail.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yes, it's very that.
It's just that bit.
I think the characterization of the Slithergees as basically warlike and ready to essentially this constant threat of just total obliteration, like violent death, if you don't sort of appease them. I think that is sort of that sort of illuminates the whole thing with them, and the way in which they're this pastiche of like the racist stereotype is basically the idea of the alien, like other race, as one that is a constant violent threat to you if you don't sort of bend over and sort of... It's like that combination of playing up their victimhood while also being incredibly violent and sort of a constant threat of like terrorism and just like... It's this whole clash of civilizations bullshit, isn't it? Because that's the classic trope of sort of conservative kind of racist mythology. The idea of the other civilization that is like undermining ours and will basically just bomb us all to death, like one way or the other.
The whole narrative, the whole refugee narrative, relies on the premise that these refugees in this story have arrived in a fully armed and overwhelmingly destructive battle cruiser. You know, just like refugees always do. And the two discs sort of embody the classic fashy contradiction that the enemy are both so strong that they can wipe us out and we need to wipe them out first, but also so weak that they're not deserving of being alive, and they're gonna sort of twist our arms with sympathy and empathy and make us submit to them with kindness.
Like the choice to make them blind. That really fascinates me. I'd forgotten that. Like I mean, I last listened to this like 10 years ago. So coming back to this, like, wait, why make them blind? Because that just seems like bizarrely throwing in like ableism onto the fucking racism grab bag, like a big old sundae with all this crap on it. It just seems like that making the Slithergees like these. I don't know. It just they just. I don't even know where to take this thought, honestly. It just seems like such an egregious way of having you also represent disability as this like terrible thing, rather than something that a human can have and just be entirely normal and not evil.
And the way the story presents accommodating disability is to enslave human beings. Accommodating disability is enslavement, right? That's what the story says.
God.
And they're constantly saying, us poor, weak, blind aliens. I think it's really important that we do point out that ableism on top of everything else.
I think the fact that the refugees, the so-called refugees, Slithergees, the fact that they were in a heavily armed battle cruiser, this breaks the story, right?
Yeah, totally, in half.
Like, none of the story's actual ideas work because of this.
No.
Can you speak to that? Can you explain why?
Yeah, so we get this sort of cliche PC president who's, she's a woman, but she's appeasing them and accommodating them, and they come to her sniveling and, oh, humble, we're so weak, and all that. And so the whole thing is trying, like Morris has said, the whole thing's trying to be about political correctness and what if we were too accommodating to people from other places. But none of that accommodation is analogous to real accommodations, because everything everyone does, including the president, is because they've got a really big gun pointed at the planet.
It doesn't work. Yeah.
It doesn't make any sense. It doesn't track as an analogy at all. None of it's about compassion or PC-ness or wokeness. It's about military threat on both sides of the disc, but military threat that for some reason pretends to be needy and sniveling, because the story wants to be about refugees in that way.
It can't even be racist properly. God, it truly fails in every conceivable aspect.
Exactly.
The story is fighting to be racist. It's actually fighting to be political. Like, the setup of it is almost asking to wash some of this out and do a more directly militaristic thing. But it's like he's fighting against this story's own logic to include this refugee stuff. It's like he can't keep it inside himself to include these observations about, the horseshoe theory and the refugee experience. It's like the actual function of the story itself is almost asking for it to go not like this way. It's like it kind of beggars belief why the story is operating in this way with this premise. So I think it's not even... I think the story is fighting to be political against its own reason at points, which just makes the politics even worse because it's like they're super intentional.
In the appeasement timeline, the Slithergees say, "Oh, we're minorities," and the president goes, "Oh, actually, you're a majority of the population these days," which is directly, that's great replacement theory. That's big racism, but also so they're not a minority. So it's not a story about minorities anyway.
Except, of course, the Little G responds, being a minority is a state of mind. Which is, even trying to turn that into like this even worse thing, I think, of like trying to, quote-unquote, satirize, I guess, some perception of what, I don't know, what minorities are like in the real world, in the minds of conservatives, I guess. People who would still complain even if you give them everything. The nonsense.
Exactly, yeah. Oh, they'll never be happy.
Yeah.
What, first they want to stop being victimized by the police, and then what? Right? What's next? They're going to put us on leashes?
The next thing I want to listen to, I alluded to earlier when I talked about the hard-hitting philosophy and politics and high-mindedness of the story. So here's an example of the intelligence of the story. Let's have a listen.
You've seen what the war did to Puxatawny, Doctor. I had to do it.
You murdered Bailey's secretary.
He was going to kill her, Mel.
Was he?
It's a matter of historical record. And what does one person matter compared to a whole world? The ends justify the means.
Lieutenant, there have been many unspeakable evils committed in the name of the ends justifying the means.
So good they make you listen to it twice.
That's a new one for me. I'd never thought of it that way before.
Amazing. Just having the antagonist just blurt out, the ends justify the means. It's
truly, this is one of the best big finishes ever written. Yeah.
It's like he's given up on writing it. Like, it's not even writing anymore. It's just having notes of themes put on a page and read out by actors.
People recommend this as a great audio, and people recommend this as one of the best big finishes there is. That is... listen to that. How can anyone say that after hearing that? This is really, really bad.
It's also it's stock Doctor Who morals, right? There's a big bag of stock Doctor Who morals. Ends justify the means, don't try to change history, don't disobey the Doctor, whatever happens. It's just grabbing them all.
On the other disc, on the other version of the scene, the Doctor explicitly follows up with, all my life I've been fighting people who think the ends justify the means. So even there it's couched in terms of this is a Doctor Who cliche. This is something we get in every story.
The rebuttal to this would be, but that's, part of the comedy, that he was self-awarely, it was a satire, it was self-awarely a bad line. One, the story is pretty clear about when it's trying to do its would-be satire. And two, I've heard a lot of Johnny Morris stories. Like, you can't trick me. You can't trick me into thinking he's a different type of writer than he is. I've heard a lot of his stories and I've liked some of them. I know what type of writer he is. That line isn't some self-aware, clever little, I'm intentionally being shit line. No, it's not. I've heard several hours of his other stories. So, yeah.
Something else related to these two scenes, that's sort of the paired scene. Obviously, the other one, which we haven't listened to here. But in the everyone's a slave to the Slither G's timeline, I think the freedom fighters, they say to the Doctor, well, anything must be better than being a slave. I don't care what happens as long as we aren't slaves anymore. And the Doctor's like, I wouldn't be so sure that anything is better. Sort of like pretentious chin stroking, like, some things could be worse than slavery, And if you imagine going to people at any point in history who were actually slaves and saying, well, it could be worse. Stop getting above your station here. Things could be worse. Like, it's just the absurdity of that is very self-evident, and yet that's what's getting put in the Doctor's mouth. As soon as it becomes about these nonsense sci-fi ideas about changing the course of history, suddenly we just get all kinds of crap. And I think generally it's just a sense of contempt towards people who want to change their circumstances and who want to change anything. And I guess a general contempt towards the idea of the radical, which obviously that's something that's so common in Doctor Who. You get it in New Who a couple of times, even in a story like the Zygon inversion, for example. That idea of just the contempt towards people who want to change like their circumstances or fight oppression, and obviously continues into Chippu with Kablam, and it's just something that seems like a perennial problem. But here it's in its purest form, I think.
This is just my underlying, who are you to, the people writing this? It's like someone in the position of Moffat or Pete McTighe or Johnny Morris. It's like, I look at these people and I look at their lots in life and are you the people to get my sense of, how revolution should or shouldn't work from? How would you know? This
is classic liberal morality. Like, thinking you basically know exactly what is right in every context.
You're a person well served by the status quo.
And what's right is whatever in the moment is sort of polite and easy.
Yeah, I'm not saying someone in their position can't write something radical or some. I'm not any. People can write anything, but it's just like I think some people, especially in a kind of majority position, get this kind of writerless state where they just kind of feel like what they're writing is kind of has equity with anything else anyone writes. And so it's like, if I write my thoughts and revolutions, that means just as much as anyone writing their thoughts and revolutions, because it's all just an intellectual exercise, right? In our country. And well, no. There's other people I would listen to above you. Anyway, the next clip is also political.
Sorry for that, community leader. How may I help you?
I have a most humble and mild request. We Slithergies have noticed that the Human Representative Committee is unrepresentative.
In what way?
There are no Slithergies on it.
But that's because it's to represent humans. There are no humans on your committee after all.
That is because a human cannot comprehend the Slithergy ethnic experience. We are being discriminated against. Please see that our quota is met.
But what you're asking is ridiculous.
I had hoped you would be more sympathetic than your late predecessor, President Mitchell. We are poor, lowly Slithergy.
I'm willing to negotiate, but...
You consider our requests to be ridiculous. Some would consider that a nastiness hate crime.
Dear God, it's so insufferable just to listen to.
Ethnic experience, hate crime. It's satire, bro. It's actually really progressive.
Morris says that he found the lines. He says he wrote some of the lines throwaways. Some of the more political things he thinks got laboured over in the performance you can't write ethnic experience like that and think, oh, that's sort of cheeky and fun. I hope nobody takes that seriously.
The number of times the words hate crime are uttered in the script, like, when you consider how fucking serious that issue is in real life, that you're just casually using as a toy to insert into the script, like, of course it's going to be a big deal. Like, the idea of just it being throwaway is completely absurd.
One of the major plot points is a very heavily implied false flag hate crime terror attack, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. In our paired The Unquiet Dead discussion, when we were talking about Lawrence Miles's responses to The Unquiet Dead, we were kind of almost uncomfortable with how oversharing they were of his own internal views and like internal neuroses and everything. And that was from, his like first person, this is my thoughts about a thing, non-fictional writing. But this story, for all that you can drape it up in satire and innovation and everything, the way he writes here, I mean, there are lines that are obviously meant to be read, very thickly, like when the Slithergy, calls itself undemocratically elected and everything. But I don't know. I feel like I get a weird vibe from all this, basically. Like Gig says, the frequency with which it talks with hate crimes and kind of the like Oliver says, the throwaway sense it talks about all these things. It treats them all as a joke, but it also treats them with a kind of seriousness. Like we heard earlier on him talking about, I made this story more silly and more serious. It's just kind of odd to me. The story belabors the point on some of these refugee things so much that it's weird.
If this were, you get a lot of reviews from the time that I've read, that go, finally Doctor Who is striking back against the PC menace. I keep wanting to say woke, but that's a new thing.
Yeah, where's the satire?
Yeah.
But also, like we talked about before, it's not a coherent warning of the dangers of PC culture, right? If you wanted to construct a narrative to show your Daily Mail viewpoint that PC culture is going to lead to the death of us all, you would have to show how sympathy leads to bad outcomes, right? You'd have to make up that story, which this isn't. This is a different story about that whole scene is dressed up like somebody using sympathy and empathy to get what they want in a malicious and evil way. But again, there's a big gun in the sky.
Yeah.
That's the reason it works. That's the reason the events can happen.
And we even get half the story about the irradiated wasteland that the Slithergies will create if they don't get what they want.
Like you're saying, with people agreeing with it straightforwardly, this is why it's, ironically, it's a joke to me to call it satire. Because satire, the whole idea of satire is you take it seriously. That's what distinguishes it from, other forms of irony and humor. It's a polemic. It's a polemic through humor. Satire is meant to suggest and raise and expose and ridicule, certain contradictions or abuses. That's what satire is. That's what distinguishes. It's not just an interchangeable word for sarcasm or irony. It's a specific type of polemic through comedy where you're exposing, something, exposing a contradiction or a tension or shortcoming or what have you. And so to just keep draping this in satire, and then it's this whole will they, won't they thing of, actually, well, some people agree with it. It's a, what is the satire exactly? Is the idea you're just, it's not satire. What it is signal boosting. It's not satirizing the Daily Mail view. It's just signal boosting the Daily Mail view. It's going, yeah, refugees, they're doing all this evil stuff. But what's the joke? Like, who is being made a joke of here? Is the joke Daily Mail readers? How? Like, in the story itself, not just in the outside sense of, well, I am not a racist, and therefore, Daily Mail readers are dumb, and this story is like me, it's smart, and so it's against the Daily Mail. That's all exterior to the story. What in the story itself is saying racism is bad, and refugee crises are serious issues and Daily Mail readers are dumb or whatever. The story isn't saying that. In fact, the story is just signal boosting the racism itself. I don't see how it's effective satire in the slightest. It's just depiction. It's not satirizing it. It's just depicting it fairly straightforwardly and with an alarming sense of verisimilitude and frequency. The word satire is just being used like a cloak or a coverall to me. I don't see how this is effective satire in the slightest. I don't see how it's satire at all, to be honest.
I mean, that's the both sides of it, right? Which is that should be the title, both sides.
He says satire. And then he'll talk, about, well, I was doing it to, look at this political thing. I was doing it to talk about how the left and the right are the same. And this was actually a political what? You're just using words now. You're just throwing around different words.
Yeah. Well, centrism means buying the premise of both sides. When you go, both sides have valid points. What you're saying is, I agree with the narrative of refugees as villainous monsters, and you can sort of limply present the other side of the story where actually the war would have also been bad, but you're presenting the argument that you're claiming to be satirizing, and you're just making that point. You're signal boosting it. You're going, look, here's the thing that I'm claiming to. There's no criticality.
There's a complacency.
It really is limp when they show the other side, because the whole fascistic human colony on the white disc is it's basically a consequence of the Slithergees turning the place into an irradiated, unlivable nightmare world, basically. So it's not actually saying, the humans are just as bad as the Slithergees, really. It's not really making much of a point of that at all. And it doesn't care. It just blows them all up in a massive explosion pretty soon anyway. So it's just incredibly hollow.
Remember all the Doctor Who magazine coverage we went over earlier, talked up all the intelligence of the story. It didn't talk up any of this, did it? It didn't talk about, subtextually, this is actually a really intelligent comment on the refugee crisis, and Morris is very progressive because no, it didn't. It came later. That came when people started pointing out what the fuck is going on here. So there's a lot of revisionism over this story, but...
Ironically.
Yeah. The fact... So this got past, at least one or two people above Johnny's head as well. And then this got out into so many fans that actually ate it up. Obviously a lot of people went, what the fuck to this, as we do now, back in the day.
I think the whole racism element must have just been, in the sense that when it passed over the heads of people in charge, I think there must just be something so normalised about the kind of register that Morris was using here, with the whole ripping Daily Mail concepts and just plopping them into a script and making the aliens act like this. I think just something about the attitude he took in writing this must have been so normalised at the company and also in the fandom for it to be able to pass and get published without anyone, even without, DWM even alluding to the thematic content. It's just a bit of window dressing it. It doesn't matter. It's just something that's floating there that doesn't merit any scrutiny. And it reminds me slightly of, I guess, maybe the Unquiet Dead thing again, and how it was so many shockwaves when Lawrence Miles pointed out a possible racist reading of this episode. It was just something that everyone was just so accepting of and just not thinking about at all.
I think with the Unquiet Dead, like Miles points out, a huge amount of people watch that episode. Big Finish is very often, especially in those days, inoculated by how niche it is. Obviously, there would have been some people who are refugees that bought this story. There would have been plenty of people that bought this story and were offended by it, either out of their own personal experiences or just their own politics. But it's still a totally different scale compared to, the accessibility of people who listen to it free on Spotify today, or people who watch the telly and can see, when a Zygon episode or a Gelth episode or whatever is saying whatever. So I think it's skated by in some senses because the type of opinion leaders that were boosted by Doctor Who as an institution, people who are published in Doctor Who magazine and whatnot, I guess were systemically the type to not find this story weird or objectionable. And the type of people, I think, too, it's like the thing I was saying earlier with, if a guy says to a teenage girl at school, go make me a sandwich, and they all laugh, and he's like, well, the joke is, wouldn't it be fun if I said that to you? And you did say that to her. You know, I think that's what this, story is. It's like, wouldn't it be funny if, refugee, blah, blah, blah. But you did do that. What is actually distinguishing Johnny Morris from a racist Daily Mail person here? Is it just this vague sense that I'm better than them? How? What have you done that distinguishes you? You had someone say, sarcastically, well, I'm an undemocratic leader. Is that really that distinctive from how the Daily Mail talks, like its sense of humor? I don't understand what's meant to be distinguishing this story from an quote-unquote actual racist story. What's the difference?
I'm saying racist things, but deep down, I'm not.
In my soul, I'm not a racist, so therefore it's actually this advanced thing called satire. It's just such a joke. And what is a example of effective Doctor Who satire to you? I come to it's not Doctor Who. I come to a modest proposal a lot just because it's over here at least it's the one that literally gets taught in schools because it's just such a teachable, clear example of here's the conceit and here's the hyperbole of it and this is what it's satirizing and this is the actual political Irish and English context of it and this is what makes it specifically pointing out a tension or a contradiction or an injustice, and this is how it's using humor to illuminate that and to point out and actionable and all that. It's a very teachable example of that, and there's none of that here. There's nothing actionable or teachable or even discernible, really. What's a Doctor Who example of satire that was effective, do you think?
Aliens of London springs to mind. That's not so much...
Yeah.
That's not doing an enormous amount with the narrative, but the setup is...
yeah.
Look at how our government are villainous.
Maybe you could cite, maybe the TV shows in the Bad Wolf Station, Series 1 again, not coincidentally.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
Just sort of, poking fun at, the kind of sort of cruel way that kind of people are treated as a game and kind of, everyone's rooting for one of them to be struck down or destroyed in these competitions or whatever.
Notice how the imagery for the Slovene doesn't look like... It doesn't look like a certain ethnicity or anything. It's an alien. And, the joke or the point of the imagery is, that these people are so alien from us. They look like a stereotypical alien. It's like these, politicians are, these power-hungry people are so different from us. They're literal aliens. But there's not and so they actually look like Jewish people or, which is basically what this story does.
I think there's something sort of vaguely... there's something quite fatphobic about the greedy, power-hungry people are big fat businessmen. But it's not.
I mean, RTD Who in general, it happens more than once.
With Aliens of London, the Iraq War stuff as well. It's it's making a point. It's not just doing the Iraq War like the story just does. Refugees are bad. It's saying. These politicians would sell you out for, they would kill you all just for money if they could. They would burn the world to the ground. There's zero care, for humanity. It's kind of, it's equivocating aliens with Tony Blair and, other supporters of the Iraq War. I guess, yeah. Anyway, Doctor Who writers, there's connections there too. But there's a point there basically in this story. What's the point is what the left and the right are the same. The point is that sometimes people go too far. That's such an axiomatic thing. That's like the sky is blue. I guess you could argue politicians are bad is something like that, but yeah.
You can't really divorce the difference between the two from the fact that Aliens of London's a story where the characters' agency is at the center for the whole thing.
Yeah.
And the big final moment is them taking a stand and, blowing up the government.
Yeah.
Versus this is a story where the characters get washed through.
Yeah, I mean, satire doesn't have to be funny or comedic necessarily. I think the element of critique and polemic is the really important bit. So Oxygen could be considered a satire of capitalism in some way, couldn't it?
Yeah.
Oxygen, there we go. That's probably the best example. Which again, it uses the premise of the world to parallel the real world, in a way that I think's more coherent than the Slithergy stuff. But it also
not a high bar.
But it also shapes the story and the characters' drama and their agency towards that point as well, with the famous moment where the Doctor literally seizes the means of production. He threatens to blow up the Capitol. He puts capital at risk, right? It gives an actionable and dramatic core to the story that this doesn't have.
This would be like if Oxygen raises the idea of air being commercialized and endorses it. Like it
yeah.
The hyperbolic element is the first step. Then the next step is you make a point about it. Here, it's like we have the hyperbolic elements of what if refugees... Well, even though the thesis is still kind of racist, isn't it? The hyperbolic element is what if refugees fucked up, everything and really manipulated everyone. In Oxygen, the hyperbolic element is what if this sort of capitalistic sense of resources being commercialized was to the extent that the very air we breathe, was a commodity. And, that has an inbuilt narrative and thesis kind of built into it, which is, that natural resources being commercialized is crazy or whatever, or is unjust. Whereas here, the hyperbolic element is refugees controlling everything. And the thesis is just this kind of vague, you can't change things, or the left and right are the same. So there's kind of a normalizing sense to this story. And so the hyperbole kind of gets smushed up with the normalizing to me, as if the story is just validating everything it's saying. I don't see what the story is trying to. I don't see how this story is trying to say what it's saying is wrong with the refugees. Maybe it's saying it's silly, but it never seems to really take any arms against it.
The thing is, the story goes on so much about how, well, you can't change history, and that's the point. Changing history can cause even worse things to happen. The thing is, that's a moral that is not applicable to real life, like in any way. It's just completely pointless, made up sci-fi rules, and it's not using those to illuminate some other, more metafictional point or anything like that. It's literally just making up some silly scenarios about how changing history turns out to be a bad thing, and just doing that, and making it go in a little loop as well.
Yeah, the Ouroboros of the whole thing ends up saying that, well, hands in the air, you probably shouldn't go to war with refugees when they arrive, but you also shouldn't accept them in any way. Which leaves you with... Which, like we mentioned before, by buying into that premise that refugees are dangerous people, means that the only message you can take away from the story is that the moment refugees enter the equation, you're fucked. There's no good outcome once people arrive in a big battle cruiser.
I don't see, I think with satire, it tends to be, the hyperbolic element is the position you don't agree with. It's, the other position. It's your opponent's position, or at least a position distinct to you. I don't see what about this story clarifies that this position isn't that of the audience or the writer. What about this story suggests that, the would-be satirical element of refugees are awful? What about it is suggesting this exaggeration is, the thing it's trying to antagonize?
Nothing.
It just seems to affirm it.
Nothing. It's just bullshit. It's just something that people have told themselves is true. There's nothing in the story to suggest that it's satirizing the Daily Mail view or critiquing that view in any way. It isn't there. There's nothing. I don't even. The question is it's not even a valid question. There is just nothing there to suggest that.
Yeah.
This isn't Zone Delta.
Oh, it is. We've materialized in exactly the same place as we first arrived. Exactly. Down to the last inch.
But it wasn't like this when we left.
It's all slums and workhouses.
Because you, Lieutenant Stewart, changed history. It's about 10:30 on the night of Christmas Eve.
But we didn't want this.
Yes, well, we can't always have what we want, can we? And it's far too late to change our minds now.
You can't have your cake and eat it.
Precisely, Mel. Like how the pudding that the other person chooses off the menu always looks far more appetizing than your own. You've swapped your future for another, Stuart, and you can't get the old one back.
It's like Gig says, it's just unmoored from reality, isn't it?
The only thing you can really take away from it is just, the contempt towards the idea of wanting better than you have.
Yeah.
When they keep going on about how you can't have your cake and eat it too. Oh, you might think the grass is greener on the other side, but it isn't. So, just suck it up and accept being enslaved or whatever it is that you've done or have.
And I suppose that contempt for wanting better than you have is itself an anti-refugee statement, right?
Yeah.
Anyone who's travelling to try and improve their lot in life, well, fuck them. anyone who wants better in any way for anyone, bad. Things should be as they are because I personally, the author of this story, am comfortable in my life.
You know, you were talking about the nature of centrism earlier, Oliver, and I think when you try to do that thing of like buying into both narratives, one of them cancels out the other. Like the right-wing one will cancel out whatever is on the other side. So you'll end up leaning towards the anti-refugee side, towards the racist side. And in practice, that is how it works. Because the centrism, the mindset is all about keeping up the carceral violence, the border violence, but just being polite about it, basically.
Exactly, yeah.
President Bailey, the Slithergee community leader has requested an audience at midnight.
Presumably to discuss the incident in Ghetto Omega Beta.
The terrorist attack?
They will hold us responsible, Deputy Mitchell. With each atrocity, we are forced to make more concessions. If I didn't know better, I would say the Slithergees welcome these hate crimes.
But you know better.
Human casualties, 312. Slithergee casualties, nil. Curiously, they evacuated shortly before the explosion. Are you sure there was no warning?
Do you think I'd have allowed those people to die? You'll have to give the community leader what it requests. You know the alternative.
Yes, you're right as always, Mitchell.
False flag.
Refugees do a false flag attack.
Hate crimes are fake. Woo!
It's satire.
The real victims of hate crimes aren't the minorities who are targeted by those hate crimes. Genius.
You know, something interesting, at one point in the story, when they talk about this hate crime, with this event where loads of humans died in the explosion, they talk about how the freedom fighters are known for attacking human collaborators with the Slithergees. And that's another point of, I think, trying to connect it historically to real things that happened. Because the idea of, retribution towards collaborators with the regime or whatever, like, that's a real thing. That's happened. That's a actual piece of, like, partisan, like, revolutionary, like, history and, like, resistance history. So it's another thing just factored in, just an extra nugget of contempt towards that. Like, basically going after collaborators means murdering 300 random people and not actually hurting the bad guys, the Slithergees, at all.
It's still just a joke. We're getting pretty specific here with the refugee narrative, but it's a joke because we're not racist. So it's a joke. Here's another very not racist joke.
We Slithergees are being provoked. We are the constant victims of hate crimes. For example, the recent vicious attack on our site guide training camp.
I'm doing all I can. I've spent the last 30 years trying to build peace between humans and Slithergees.
And yet you refuse to punish the perpetrators.
I require evidence.
So you think we're liars, do you?
Not at all. I understand.
I understand only too well. We are an oppressed, downtrodden minority.
With all due respect, you occupy over 9/10 of the planet's surface. You hardly constitute a minority.
Being a minority has nothing to do with how many of us there are. It is a state of mind. Wherever we go, we find nothing but prejudice and intolerance. Nevertheless, we humbly and meekly demand extra protection. And more site guides. And longer curfews for humans. You know the alternative.
Yes.
So I note they talk about there being a lack of evidence and how basically the president is being asked to just take on faith whoever the Slithergees say is bad and whoever they say did this or that. And I guess it reminds me of all this shit about how, facts don't care about your feelings or reality matters. You're just, that you get now. I think just the idea of sending up the idea of, accountability for any sort of racism as something that can just be accused, that just gets accused without evidence, and how all accusations of racism are fake. I think that's just what it sounds like. I think it's just mimicking that really absurd, kind of distorted view of reality, but just making that into the story.
I mean, that's the implication, right? The minorities, like the Slithergy, actually face no hate crimes at all. Hate crimes are just a thing they made up to gain political power. That's what the story's saying.
Yeah.
It's as simple as that.
And being a minority is a state of mind that they take around with them, like a defect of character, rather than actual material phenomenon.
Which is such, because that's not a thing. That's not a thing people believe.
No.
It doesn't even, there's no, that's not even an effective exaggeratory parody of refugees or minorities in general, because nobody's saying that being a minority is a state of mind. That's not a thing anyone thinks.
It's just a it's just a depiction of how the racist mind views the minority. It's a racist assumption of how a minority must actually think or feel. The idea that it's all just a performance, it's all just bullshit.
I have a Christmassy clip next.
Anything else?
As the undemocratically elected Slithergy representative, I must protest at your recent seasonal broadcast.
But I made it clear that goodwill should be extended to all Slithergies.
The Slithergies do not recognize the concept of Christmas. We find it an affront to our ethnic beliefs.
But it's Christmas. We teach Slithergy culture in our schools. We
would prefer it if it were replaced by Slime-Tide Solstice. We have no objection to humans continuing with their superstitious ceremonies, so long as it's made quite clear that they're wrong.
I don't want to argue, but...
You would prefer to persecute us for our beliefs? That is dangerously close to a hate crime.
Please excuse me.
The specific made-up festive season Slime-Tide Solstice, particularly weird because what it seems to evoke to me is the sort of solstice, the choice of that word, evokes the pagan winter festive seasons which Christmas is based on, which seems to unravel the whole we're being replaced narrative quite thoroughly when, that tells you something about Christmas itself. And the whole Christmas, the very light dusting of snow that Christmas themes this story. What it really feels like it comes to me is that it's the opposite of A Christmas Carol. It's looking at the past and the future and going, actually nothing is going to change. It's the exact opposite of that story. It's looking at the bad things inherent in this society and going, actually they're fine. Let's just leave it. Let's not try to change anything. It's as un-Christmas as things get.
I feel like this is the sort of thing where people would really argue, well, it is satire and it's a joke because, haha, war on Christmas, that's something conservative people complain about. And we're doing it in this story, so it's a joke. But what goodwill have you earned to frame it as a joke? Like, the Slithergy are just kind of saying the stuff you would get from actual people is, straw men of what they think, I don't know, people who don't celebrate Christmas are like. The story has been so racist already that I don't think it has the goodwill to go, ha ha ha, isn't this funny? It's the idea of that there's a war on Christmas. It just comes more straightforwardly across as like an unironic war on Christmas thing, which I don't think Johnny Morris actually believes in. But I think the story he's written has been so kind of noxious to this point that he's inadvertently created something where it seems like he has a character, kind of straightforwardly putting forward this narrative. The whole story has felt so poisonous up to this point, where I think what he wants to be just like a very bland kind of ha ha ha, people say this thing happens and it's crazy, just comes across kind of more chilling because he's got all this he has all this actual racialized stuff about, the ethnic experience and the hate crime stuff in there. So this just feels like more ammunition for the very weird things this story seems to be saying, rather than, I think, like the joke he was trying to have it come across as.
It's an alarmingly detailed white persecution fantasy.
There's too much verisimilitude.
That's the thing. The detail of teaching their culture in our schools and all of that, and of course the war on Christmas stuff. It really is. It's quite visceral in just how uncomfortably it's trying to just invoke all these racist ideas.
President Mitchell, I have been in conference with the Slithergy Representative Committee.
Community leader, I'm afraid this isn't a good time.
We humbly and mildly venture to suggest that it is no longer appropriate for there to be a human president of Puxatorney. We consider this an inequality of opportunity.
But if it wasn't for me, you wouldn't even...
We would like to express our gratitude for your past cooperation, but now you are superfluous to requirements. If you could please speak, I need to locate your position in the room. For I am a poor, blind Slithergy and cannot see.
No!
Ah! There you are. Now I shall be the president of Puxatorney, the planet of the Slithergies.
Again, really up there with Chimes of Midnight level writing here, guys. Just incredible stuff.
If I tried to, be very selective and frame Jim Mortimer's Natural History of Fear or any Shim and stuff badly, there's nothing I can get that's like this. This story is very singular.
Yeah, I think what it is that when, often in Doctor Who, like many times in Classic Who or New Who, when something is being poked out or made fun of through the means of like a evil antagonist or alien race or whatever that's behaving in this absurd way, usually it's the thing that's being satirized is whatever the villain is doing will be an maybe exaggerated version of the thing that the writer, like Robert Holmes or whoever, is trying to poke fun at. So, and that's basically the model that this is mimicking. So at the end of the day, all it ends up being is functioning as just like a sort of appallingly, appallingly just unpleasant depiction of the foreigner, the alien. That's all it ends up being.
As a sort of synecdoche, that little scene could, if the story knew what it was trying to do with the anti-PC stuff, that little scene could have been a possibly clever, if horrible and bigoted, way of demonstrating how vulnerable and powerless people are actually, attacking you by twisting your arm. Slithergy can't see, needs his victim to say where they are so that they can be executed. And if that scene had played like the Slithergy actually applying emotional pressure to make the guy reveal himself so he can be executed, that would have been still bad, very obviously, but a coherent demonstration of what it's trying to do. But instead, like we've said again and again, it just doesn't hold as a narrative, because obviously the people with power in a given situation are the people with power. The people without it don't get that power by abusing sympathy, because that's not how things actually work. A man isn't going to say, "Here I am, please shoot me."
Or in this case, just shout no and get shot, because this script is so full of flavour and character.
Exactly, right? It has to contrive to get him to do that, which breaks the whole point of the scene, which is emblematic of the fact that the whole point of the story doesn't work, because its central idea doesn't hold. The people who arrive on a shore needing help aren't secretly the most powerful and controlling and manipulative people in society. That's not true. And so the story doesn't work.
Not too keen on this version of the future, then?
We've seen our planet reduced to a waste ground. What do you think?
It's like a vision of hell. Out there, nothing can survive. Nothing can grow.
At least with the Slithergees there was a chance.
Well, it just goes to show. I bet you wish you'd never changed the past now.
And that's why we want you to take us back, Doctor. Take us back to yesterday.
To Christmas Eve? Why?
We want to prevent ourselves from travelling in your TARDIS. We want to prevent ourselves from changing history.
Now, hang on. You're saying you want to go back in time to stop your earlier selves from going back in time?
Exactly.
I can't do it.
You will, Doctor, or I'll crush these crystals.
No, you don't understand. That history doesn't exist anymore. The Doctor can't take you there because it's gone.
Doctor, you will do as I say. 1, 2...
Oh, very well. But I'm getting a little weary of your threats. This is the very last time.
This isn't Ghetto Delta Delta.
Oh, yes it is. We've landed in precisely the same place as when we first arrived. Precisely down to the last inch.
But this isn't how it was when we left.
No, but you changed history, didn't you? It's about 10:30 on the night of Christmas Eve, as requested.
But we don't want this. We want Puxatorney back to how it was. How it was when we first stepped into the TARDIS.
Yes, well, we always wish for what might have been, don't we? Until we find out that it's not actually any better than what we've already got.
The grass is always greener on the other side.
Exactly, Mel. Like how the other person's newspaper always seems much more fascinating than your own.
I have to say, I love how people living in slavery or whatever are just being likened to wanting someone else's newspaper at this point. It's a great illustration of just how the macro and the micro are being sort of collapsed together in a way that doesn't really hold any water. Just sort of trivializing real problems.
It's Neo, it's what you were saying before, that this isn't the viewpoint of someone who really understands the topic. This is a layperson's, it seems to me like it's the same either way, right? People do material analysis. People measure things, they do research, they think a lot about these ideas, but this whole story is just, seems like they're pretty much the same. Seems like these two timelines are exactly identical, and anyone who's quibbling over their lot in life is a fool and an idiot.
And note how in this clip, what the freedom fighters want after discovering this new timeline is they want to just snip, snap, reverse back to being slaves under the Slithergees, instead of, like, I don't know, trying to... they have a time machine at their disposal. Instead of thinking, maybe we can try and fix some other thing, stop this whole horrible war we created from happening. No, let's just go flip back to the other timeline and go back. It's just... They are so inherently unrealistic as characters. I think they are written to be so intentionally just incredibly crude and stupid and misguided and bad, and their only solution to everything is killing a random person. So the story essentially stops being about how changing history is bad and just gets completely distorted by how crude these characters are.
I want to look at some comments Johnny Morris made later, like a decade and more later than this story, because I think that's only fair. So, in one interview from around a decade later, 2011, the interviewer, Doc Oho, asks him, he says, Flip-Flop has an extremely unusual structure in that it is a story with 2 discs that can be told in either order. Where on earth did you begin plotting their experimental story out, was there any point where you thought this isn't going to work? How successful do you think it turned out as a story? And Johnny says, I'd say that Flip Flop is so experimental it doesn't even have a plot as such. It's more an exercise in storytelling patterns, in the mechanics of it. Because once I had hit on the 2 discs in either order idea, that meant I had to use that to the fullest. Sidebar, did it? Anyway, had to use that to the fullest, with characters having doubles, parallel universes, time, travel. I was determined I would do all these ideas first. As a script, it's probably better read than listened to, as the end result is far too repetitive. In my defense, it's repetitive for the sake of clarity, but I think by episode 3, in either order, the listener has probably got the story. As I recall, there were numerous points where I thought it wasn't going to work, because there are so many threads of cause and effect to keep an eye on, and all the time I'm thinking through the time travel logic of it. The end result? I really like the Slithergees and Professor Capra, and I like some of the moral ideas in there, of people being neither good nor evil, but products of history, and of people always thinking the grass would have been greener on the other side. I think that's a very relevant idea when you have people basing whole arguments around what-ifs, i.e. would the world have been a better or worse place if we hadn't had the invasion of Iraq? And it's about how...
Oh my god.
and it's about how we sometimes judge people in the past unfairly, condemning with the benefit of hindsight. I'm very proud of bits like the terrorists being appalled by the actions of the police, and the police being appalled by the actions of the terrorists, when they are in fact the same people. Aside from the repetition, the other parts of it I think I should have done better is that firstly, the moral of the story is a bit bleak. Damned if you do, damned if you don't. And it would have been even cleverer, I think, if both discs had had happy endings. And the story is lopsided. In one version of history, you have the Slithergees, who are very entertaining, while on the other, you don't really have anything. Politically, with the Slithergees, I was playing devil's advocate. The intention was never to be anti-immigration, but against some of the excesses of a certain type of patronizing political correctness. I enjoyed Dan's performance, but I think some lines which were written as throwaways got a bit laboured over. And I was surprised by the Slithergees' appearance on the CD sleeve. In my imagination, they were just giant slugs, whereas on the cover they look like caricatures of Jewish old men. And that's the ending of that flip-floppy bit of that Doc Oho interview. Oliver had talked about parts of that interview earlier, but yeah, what do we think of all that?
There's a lot to respond to there. I'm overwhelmed slightly. My God. Yeah, I think the Iraq comment just kind of illuminates the whole thing, isn't it? The idea that just being so bothered by people criticising anything that, Tony Blair or whoever would do. Well, actually, you don't know if the world would have been better if we hadn't pointlessly invaded this country based on a lie and killed countless people for no real reason. Amazing stuff. Just amazing centrist brains. You gotta love them.
Going through a history of the worst war crimes in the history of the world and going, you know what? Who knows if any of these were good or bad in the long run?
And the thing is, when he talks about how, I wasn't being anti-immigration, anti-immigrant, I was just being anti the political correctness. Because when it goes too far, it goes too far. I think that's so disingenuous, I think. Because when you can't really, I don't think, as Mel says in the story, you can't have your cake and eat it too. I think in doing this whole exaggerated, what if political correctness bad? And there needs to be a limit to political correctness and caring too much about racism. When you do that, in a sense, you are essentially just reiterating the kind of the anti-immigrant narrative is embedded in what you're doing there. If you're trying to undermine sort of the concept of sort of pro-refugee sentiment in doing this absurd, exaggerated version of it. Yeah, all you're basically doing is you're just providing ammunition to the anti-refugee point of view. See what I mean?
Yeah. In 2021, Morris said,
It's very. I mean, there's things like the sort of the Back to the Future 2 type time stuff of people running around in their own scenes is very complicated, but it was very hard, very, very. It's so intricate. I would never do anything like that now. And some of the politics works, and some of it doesn't. I think sort of the whole point of the whole exercise was the idea that you can judge the past based on what you think might have been. The whole idea of if Neville Chamberlain hadn't appeased Hitler, would things have been better? Was he a bad leader for doing that or a good leader for doing that? And I'm just sort of going, well, if you could travel into that other version of history, would it be better? Would it be worse? And there's a couple of characters in it who, in one version of the history, become sort of, basically terrorists. And in the other one, they become sort of fascist policemen. And it's pointing out that these people, although they're sort of shaped by experience, they end up with the same sort of morals, the same sort of ethics. They're just on completely different sides of the system. So there's stuff in there which I think is quite clever. I mean, but it's one of those stories where there's people who love it. There's people that go, "This is the best thing you've ever done, Johnny. Nothing you've done since is anywhere near as good." And there's a lot of people where it makes them extremely angry. And so it's a bit of a flip-flop in that sort of sense, really.
See, that thing about the two versions of Stewart and Reed being it's so ironic and clever that they're the same person, even though they are appalled by each other's actions. I think, again, it's incredibly hollow because at the end of the day, the whole thing of them being the same person, it's just a writerly contrivance. There's no real reason for them to be the same person, the same people, if they've had completely different lives. It's only that way because the writer insists on having the two discs mirror each other to the last detail. He thinks he's making some great point about how people on both sides of the dispute are just the same, really. But in a sense, he makes a point of writing these characters behave in ways that are often just really, really ridiculous and very easy to condemn. And he usually has them saying, "The ends justify the means," to the Doctor, who then immediately condemns them for that. So it's really not as great of a point as he seems to think it is.
And then, like you said before, the moment they see the future, they go, "Oh, of course we were wrong. You were right." They're such cut out little. It's the whole thing. There's no sense of any thrust in the story coming from the story itself. It's very, very written, the whole thing, which isn't always a bad thing, but it really takes the air out of something like this.
At the end of 2016 and the start of 2017, Johnny did some tweetalongs of the story. And so his first tweet of the tweetalong clarifies something. He says, "Okay, live tweeting Doctor Who flip-flop first half, starting with the black disc, because that's the order I wrote it in."
That tracks, I think. When I, on my re-listen, I listened to disc black first. And honestly, I feel like black first is sort of the right way to listen to it. And not that there is one, of course. But when you look at the way they're structured, like on the black side, nothing really happens. At least on the white disc, there's a sense of finality because the Stewarts and Reeds all get vaporized, two of them off screen, as it were. But it ends with that, disc white ends with the Lieutenant Stewart and Reed dying horribly in an incredibly sort of pointless, time paradoxical way. And that at least feels like a punctuation mark on the story, if you see what I mean.
Yeah.
Whereas the black disc literally just ends with nothing. The Doctor and Mel, they're in a cell, they break out the cell, they leave. That's the end of that bit. So it does feel like, in terms of the classic four-parter structure, the end of disc black and the start of disc white is like the middle bit in a shitty serial, the lull in the action. Whereas the end of white disc is like the more of an end. So yeah, it tracks that he wrote black first.
I was going to say on Spotify it's white and black.
Johnny goes on to tweet, quote, "I haven't listened to it for at least 10 years and have all sorts of mixed feelings towards it." Later on, he says, "The Slithergees do sound excellent. I'd forgotten all about that. and I'd forgotten it was set at Christmas. Amazing, excellent atmosphere. He says, I'm not sure if I'll go into the politics of the Slithergees. They were intended to make listeners uncomfortable, like proper monsters.
Ooh.
But my main thinking was to parody a sort of do-gooding middle-class guilt, which I think deserves parody, but maybe my aim missed.
Yeah, I think the thing is, if you were trying to parody that sort of middle class, I guess, performative guilt or whatever, you'd have to actually go after it. Like in real life, they don't have a big alien gun pointed to their head, forcing them to do all of it. Yeah, and the problem is that it's insincere and comes from a position of privilege that they have. Not that the immigrants are actually evil and gonna murder everyone or anything like that, or turn people into slaves. So yes, it's a complete miss, and I think it just betrays a complete fundamental lack of understanding of whatever reality you might have been trying to parody there.
He goes on to say, the stuff about minority status and community leaders, I thought it would be amusing to have aliens that were like Daily Mail villains, parentheses, the target being the ludicrousness of the Daily Mail caricature of minorities, comma, not the minorities themselves.
And yeah, I think in terms of using the whole idea of sending up the Daily Mail character and sort of making fun of it is neutralised by the fact it's a Doctor Who alien, which are already, by design, they already function in that way of being slightly heightened versions of real things. So the whole element of it supposedly being like a send-up just sort of gets lost. I think it doesn't really function. It just feels like a Doctor Who alien that happens to be like attacking refugees.
He says, the complexity of this was mind-boggling. Every episode has another Doctor and Mel running around in the background, and almost every scene in the black disc is a mirror of the same scene on the white disc. Everything is doing 3 things at once. Later he says, not sure the suicide would be acceptable now. Not sure it was acceptable then, TBH.
By the suicide, I assume, does he mean the President Bailey on the black disc? Or is there something else? I guess that won't be immediately obvious from the tweet itself, will it? I can't think of anything else that would apply to. See, in that scene, I found myself kind of...
The machine blows up. That's sort of a suicide.
Yeah, in a sense. But in the scene that I was thinking of where the President dies in the present, I was kind of wondering if they were playing it as ambiguous, whether she killed herself or whether her deputy Prime Minister murdered her. Because he just goes like, no, and then there's a sound effect like, pew, and then she's dead. And I just found myself wondering if like it was a shootout thing, and she was going to try and kill him. Because she says, get your back against the wall. And then, yeah, so I don't know, maybe I'm completely wrong. He could be talking about something else in the story. But yeah, I did wonder about her talking about suicide.
Considering it's the only action in the whole audio, all those shootouts and the assassinations are really badly produced.
Yeah,
like it's hard to tell what's going on. The guns are terrible. The timing's off for all of them. It's hardly my biggest complaint, but it does irk me.
There's a lot of talk about them being vaporized and stuff, but then whenever someone gets shot, they're like, and then you hear them falling to the ground. So are they being vaporized or not?
Johnny later says, yes, this is uncomfortable listening in places. Deliberately so. That's what I was going for. Not sure I would do that now.
Well, I think the thing about chasing discomfort is that, and you see this a lot, I think, with people who think they're being funny or provocative or whatever, is that, it's always going to make some people more uncomfortable than others.
Yeah.
And that's the thing. I think a lack of awareness of who exactly you're sort of needling is just what leads to just really, I think people are willfully unaware when they do stuff like this.
He says there were 3 sort of inspirations for the damned if you do, damned if you don't thing. Firstly, mainly, Neville Chamberlain. The idea that history judges him as being naive because of appeasement. But what if he'd done the opposite? Would things be better? Another one was that a very similar situation was presenting itself with the then imminent Iraq War. The idea that the road not taken is always assumed to be the better one. Grass is greener, etc. You have politicians now using that as a justification/criticism, a hypothetical parallel universe where things are better/worse. Clearly a recent development. People talking in hypotheticals.
Clearly the reason people oppose the Iraq war is just that the grass is greener on the other side. Like, they didn't have actual reasons, of course.
So yeah, those Iraqi children being alive, fuck me, that could have been quite the toxic situation.
Who knows if it was better or worse,
Unjustified war where, untold numbers died, but it could have also been bad if that didn't happen.
It's just the benefit of hindsight, Neo. God, how can you only say it was bad because you have the benefit of hindsight.
It's such a fucking comfortable British Doctor Who writer's view that, I don't know, there's people in Iraq, them dying was okay.
No one knew at the time it was going to be bad.
It's just fuck off. It's a truly evil thing to say, maybe, it's people died, man. Like, what is he talking about? I think part of the function of him doing this tweet-along is to try and, not rejuvenate, try to redeem himself a bit. That's why he's like saying, not sure I'd do that again now with some stuff. And then he's saying, well, all those Iraqi people that died, maybe that was fine. Maybe the alternative would have been worse. So you never really know, do you? You never know if illegal unjustified wars were a good idea or not. Because Paul Cornell is on board, so therefore it must be a good idea. That's who I take my cues from. That's how we know whether wars are justified or not. Let's look to the other Doctor Who writers. He said evil shit back in this audio and is saying evil shit back in the end of 2016 here. Fuck off. With any Iraq war was good actually thing. It's just monstrous.
And then, of course, much later, he'd go on to compare the Ninth Doctor to Tony Blair, which maybe says something about how he continues to think about the Iraq war. I don't know.
I have no respect for people doing this. If you play around with, incredibly unjustified war, and that's the scale of life there. If that's just an intellectual exercise to you, like this shitty audio that you wrote, and if that's all an intellectual thing to you to be like, well, a lot of people say it was bad, so what if it was good? Like, it's not only malevolent and evil, it's also incredibly unintelligent. It's like a kid doing an opposite day thing. What if good thing bad? I've got you there, haven't I? I've reversed the thing. I've reversed the polarity of your statement. I've reversed your idea that death is bad. What if death is good?
I see you're anti-capitalist, but you have a phone.
Yeah, it's just fuck me. This is from the would-be redemptive, 2000s tweet-along, where he's trying to, I think partly trying to redeem himself over some of the weird politics. And it's like, well, yes, the Jewish anti-Semitism stuff is awful, but Iraqis, go fucking die. Fuck you. It's monstrous. Anyway, he says other things. When he's talking about some of the dialogue for the story, some of the very Pip and Jane type dialogue, he says Flip-Flop was written under the influence of the One Doctor, and so Seventh and Mel were deliberately giving some Pip and Jane type lines. The One Doctor is another Christmas Big Finish audio from the pre-New Who era by Gareth Roberts and Clayton Hickman. And I think it actually presages Series 1 in some interesting ways, because it's got this huge fascination with TV, reality TV specifically. And it's a very overt comedy, and he says it was a big influence for this story. Look, there's stuff to talk about with that. I mean, it's from Gareth Roberts, but it's also good. The One Doctor works as...
Yeah, it's actually funny.
It's actually funny, and it works as a story, and it knows what it wants to be, and it succeeds at what it wants to be. What else does he say? He says... he talks about the sexual content. When the couple of... Well, the cheating couple are kissing, and the president is saying, let me unwrap it. He says, now you see, this was the no-holds-barred era of the audios, Jubilee, and all that.
Is that all he says on the topic?
Yeah, I guess you got away with more sex stuff.
The thing about the sex sequences in this, well, there's two, is the fact that it's immediately interrupted with violence and murder. So this guy and this woman are naked as people storm in and shoot them to death, and it just seems to add an extra level of undignifiedness to the whole proceedings. Like, and almost like just real just unpleasant cynicism. Like, oh yeah, let's strip this woman naked before we shoot her dead. And it's like, what's even going on? Why are you making us listen to this? It's I really wonder that whole sexual subplot in the episode. Like, why is it there?
Well, he answers you. He says, I thought I'd include a silly sex scene in Doctor Who, particularly to be provocative, but also as a contrast to bleakness.
Right. I feel like it wasn't much of a contrast.
But it's so bleak in and of itself.
It compounds it, really.
And especially because it's framed in such a... It makes her such a miserable character, and then it gives her a really miserable death. Ugh.
Yeah.
Just the whole thing, very nasty, very, very sour.
And you get lots of betrayed sounding monologues from the other guy who fancies her, but who she doesn't like. And he gets to rant a lot about how, oh, it should have been me, oh, I loved you, oh, I'm so blah, blah. So, you get lots of that. And it is all quite bleak. It's just, infidelity or something. And just, it's just a whole mess of shit that's there for some reason. And that whole thing about, let's be provocative for provocativeness' sake. It's just a little bit, it's puerile.
So we're still end of 2016, start of 2017. He says, I'm still proud that the main idea behind Flip Flop hasn't been done anywhere else. Well, there's a novel that does something similar, but I'm not going to tell you what it is because it's a spoiler, and it's only broadly similar, but not the same. And of course, Flip Flop is the only science fiction story with genuine alternate universes.
Wait, what?
What?
What's a genuine...
He said that before. I think he's being facetious with that, talking about how the story, like literally alternate, like they reflect each other, I think.
Because the universes go into one another, I guess. They keep causing each other, so it alternates. It actually alternates. I see what you mean. Still, it's just annoying.
A decade plus following the story, he found one other story in the world that does something similar to how this works, so he got out there.
Bravo.
Anyway, here's more inspo. He says, I'm proud of the idea that Stuart and Reed are fascist guards in one life and terrorists in another, same people, different worlds. Also very proud that the cliffhanger is the TARDIS arriving. Hasn't been done before or since, I think? ?
Omega.
He's really obsessed with this idea of unprecedentedness, isn't he? It's incredibly superficial.
Which annoys me, because, it's a cheap thing to chase, being the first to do something, because the whole thing of art, the whole art culture is recycling ideas and sharing and cross-pollinating. And if you're the first person to do something ever, sometimes that's because you're a once-in-a-lifetime individual mega genius. But almost always, either you're not, or the precise little niche that you found you're the first person to do isn't very good, and everyone else has decided not to do it because it's not very impressive.
Yeah, there's kind of a reason the TARDIS disappearing isn't usually used as a cliffhanger. It's because it's not very dramatic at all.
Doesn't really work.
Other things he says is the third inspiration of the story. Well, the story rather charts the mindset of someone who has just come out of a long-term relationship. Because in that situation, you think maybe things would have been better if you'd never met, if you'd spent that time with someone else. He's not sure if that was intentional, but it seems obvious in retrospect.
Joking apart.
Yeah.
When he gets up to part 4 in this tweet-along, he says, I realise it's repetitive, but for once, that's the point. Things should feel like they're falling into place.
The whole live tweet experience of this story must have been, just pain. Wow, having loads of people listening to it at the same time, just experiencing all just the sheer thudding sameness and repetitiveness and lameness of this story, or live tweeting it, assuming anyone even was. My God, it must have been awkward. Imagine sitting in a room with this story playing on the CD player with Jonathan Morris, and then just an audience, and everyone just listens to lines like, the ends justify the means, and the whole hour repeating itself. God, I want to run a mile.
He says the problem with the complex, fast choreography of this is that, even more than usual, characterization takes a back seat.
I'll say.
On the other hand, Flip Flop is trying to do a dozen things that have never been done before at once and reward multiple listens, so yay me.
Reward multiple listens with what? If there's no characterization in the story, what are you even rewarding us with? Oh, hey, I noticed a thing. It's so shallow.
He does say, if I was doing this story now, I'd do it differently. Not necessarily better. Lose the...
I mean, that tracks with the ideology of the story. You know, different isn't necessarily better, yeah?
Lose the fast plotting, focus more on characters. He also says, I like the idea that one history is kind of left-wing, the other is kind of right-wing. But they could be balanced better because one history has the slithergies, which are fun, while the other just has radiation. It's not as interesting, is it?
Yes, the notorious left-wing history where everyone is being turned into slaves. Just great. Well, I don't know. I say that's suggestive. That is illustrative of whatever ideological viewpoint the story is being written from, I think. Just conceiving of left and right in that sort of way.
He also says, back to the slithergy stuff. Nowadays, I'd have them claiming to be anti-establishment and persecuted by a metropolitan elite. This is basically their modus operandi. And then he links to a Wikipedia article on victim playing.
So it sounds like there that he envisions them as, in this hypothetical new version, as being like, I don't know, Brexit or something, or like sort of like a far-right kind of, hey, QAnon type people, anti-MSM kind of people.
I have one more bit from this tweet along, and then the last thing I have is from 2 years later, in 2019. So from the ending of this tweet along, he says, still mixed feelings towards Flip Flop. On the one hand, it would work much better as a book. Sidebar, that's quite a progression, isn't it? He was saying the opposite back when this came out, so he has changed his mind on some things. So he says, on the one hand, it would work much better as a book where readers can flip back and forth and thus pick up on stuff. On the other hand, if it was a book, you wouldn't be able to do that 2 starts and 2 ends thing. Unless you start going into B.S. Johnson territory and made it a book that could be read in 2 ways, maybe do the upside down thing, while the back of one book is the upside down front of the other, but no, never going to happen, onwards and upwards. Hashtag flip-flop.
So he has heard of an author, at least, who did the kind of things that he was vaunting as being so unique.
Yeah. The last tweet chain is pretty juicy. The originating tweet of this tweet chain is deleted, but the rest of the tweet chain goes like this, and this is from December 2019. I have found this episode particularly disheartening because, in my own little way, I've tried to be a champion of diversity. The one time I got to commission writers, I sought out female writers I'd never met. Every script I've made, sure, gender balance, varied ages, etc. So it saddens me to see that, in some people's eyes, that counts for nothing. I thought it was obvious that I was on the side of equality. It seems that people who don't know me, who don't know my work, don't realize that. So I shall just have to keep on trying. It's at times like these I think of the wise words spoken by Beryl Reid in Earthshock, 1982. The enemy's outside, mister. You're pointing your gun in the wrong direction. Sadly, it seems they are unconvinced by my progressive bona fides. And one of them has accused me of being racist and transphobic. I'm not going to defend myself. I trust that anyone reading this will know it's bollocks. But I've had enough. I'm locking this account for a bit. Now, there's some more deleted replies in this chain. But he goes on.
I loved your reading of that with all the pauses. Very good.
He goes on further down this chain, and this tweet was deleted by the tweet author. Learn more. So who knows what set this off. But he continues and he says, I never intended for it to be open to interpretation in this way. It was about stuff going on in 2002 and intended for listeners in 2003. It was intended to be provocative and challenging, and I was deliberately writing against my own left-wing, pro-refugees values. Because ideas explored in fiction do not and should not be taken as being the beliefs held by the author. Authors often write stories which go against their own beliefs. I think most people understood that. That's certainly how it was taken at the time. Of course, nowadays, people are more eager to ascribe motives to authors based on their fiction. So if I was writing it now, I'd make sure it couldn't be misinterpreted as being anti-refugee, and make sure that it couldn't be misinterpreted in the context of the world of 2019. What it was about were two ideas. The idea that people's political beliefs are a product of their environment, that one's fascist policemen are another universe's terrorists. And secondly, the idea that it is unfair to condemn with the benefit of hindsight. The idea that the grass is always greener on the other side, that if X hadn't done so and so, then things would have been better. I.e., if the US hadn't removed Saddam Hussein from power, would things be more peaceful in the Middle East now? Maybe. Or maybe it would have been worse. There's no way of knowing. So you can see it was about stuff from 2002. One last thing. If it had been anti-immigrant, I don't think it would have been made. Gary Russell wouldn't have permitted it, and I don't think the BBC would have approved it. And there's another tweet deleted, but he goes on and he says, absolutely, in reference to whatever deleted tweet. As that article says, the way works are viewed now is different to the past. Flip-flop was not viewed that way at the time. I read all the reviews and Outpost Gallifrey threads assiduously. There was some criticism of the cover, but that was nothing to do with me. So there's his epic 2019 response to flip-flop revisionism.
I love that whole first defensive spiel he went on. Some of them have even called me racist. I was like, is this Jonathan Morris or John Barrowman writing here? I love this whole aggrieved, wounded posture that these writers always adopt when someone starts calling them out on this shit. It's great.
And again, like we were talking about regarding The Unquiet Dead, it's back to that whole taking it as making criticism of the work an attack on you personally and going, well, but I know I am not a racist.
Mm-hmm.
I know that about myself and I can't be. So therefore, the work doesn't deserve that critique.
I loved that comment he made about how, well, if it was really racist, then the BBC wouldn't have allowed it and Big Finish wouldn't have made it. It's like, that's just such fucking nonsense. Like, the BBC, allows racist things to be made, now, actual, fucking, it's really not some pure saintly organisation. And it's just, I think just a degree of myopia. I think almost, it reminds me of, Lawrence Miles making sort of minimizing the racism of classic hero. I think people just have these assumptions about how saintly whatever their favorite thing is, and well, there's no way any racism would be allowed in, and it's complete nonsense.
Also, as we talked about before, there are reviews from the site going, at last, anti-PC, finally Big Finish is striking against the cultural menace.
I actually think the idea that he doesn't entertain the idea that people found it racist then betrays so much about his position and kind of, I think, illegitimizes whatever kind of stance he's having there. Because it's projecting his own kind of monocultural view of everything onto it in a way that kind of makes me feel like he's not actually taking anything in good faith there. Is he truly believing that because Outpost Gallifrey didn't have any reviews going, what the fuck, man, back in 2003, that the revisionism, as we can call it, towards the story, some kind of modern, misguided thing. It's like the A racist. He's not really thinking about what people are saying, I think.
Yeah, there was a period of time where I conceived of Morris as one of the people who at Big Finish who would write things that I liked. So stuff like Mastermind, the Companion Chronicle, where you have Geoffrey Beevers kind of narrating this whole gangster tale to Grace and Chang Lee, who are playing different characters. or like Protect and Survive, which is about Ace and Hex putting this kind of nuclear fallout sort of scenario. Like, you know, there were some good things actually coming out of this guy, but I think then he sort of, I guess, as with every Big Finish writer who seems good at some point, they dilute whatever they have going on with countless audios that get worse and worse and worse, and they end up just pumping out so much shit that the gems among the rough just get lost in the smooge, as it were, as Morris would put it.
Yeah.
So yeah. I suppose there's maybe like just one summative thing I kind of want to say, which is that the formal gimmick that people praise the story so much for, and are so fascinated by, is in its essence such a bleak, hopeless, fatalistic, nihilistic, self-defeating, and really just quite bitterly cynical, like husk of just shit. That it's, I think some part of it is actually just kind of just sort of stuck with me and appalled me quietly ever since I listened to it, like, you know, a decade ago. Because I mean, that's the part of the story that stuck out the most for me, even before I was really attuned to how like racist it was being. Just that sheer cynicism to be able to write something like this and think, oh yeah, this is fine, let's publish this. This is a completed Doctor Who story. Just a completely self-annihilating reality spiral of two interlocking timelines that will never resolve, and everything will be terrible forever. And you know, the Doctor is just completely pointless. I just think something about that is such an appalling like thing for a story to leave behind. You know, it's just one of these things I wish it hadn't been written, because it's just such a horrible little kind of stain, an ugly little stain on like a period of Big Finish that was otherwise pretty good, like in a lot of ways.
People stop putting this in the same breath as Holy Terror and Natural History and even Live 34 and whatnot. It does not deserve to be in the same breath of them as all. There was some great stuff going on at this time, and this was not.
I'm kind of now I'm imagining if there was ever some incident where like they took it off Spotify or stopped selling it or something, like some episodes of Sarah Jane Adventures have been taken off.
Yeah,
there'd be such outcry, wouldn't there? Yeah. No, this most amazing, ingenious Big Finish story has been cancelled by the woke mob. It would all come out. That'd be hilarious.
And that wraps up our discussion on 2003's Flip Flop. Listeners, thank you for going on this odyssey with us. As always, please chime in at midnight or otherwise. Chime in with your own comments, thoughts, opinions, whether on this story itself, what we expressed about Flip Flop, things we didn't say or express or get to about Flip Flop, anything else in your head. We always give the comments a read. We always love to read them, so go ahead with that. But most importantly, have a Merry Christmas. Have a great festive period. Hopefully have a nice holiday, whatever you celebrate. Whether you're listening to this in a December or an entirely different month, I hope some festive cheer makes its way to you. And again, thank you very much for listening. Cheers.